Hello everyone, I'm Josh Kess, and I'm going to be showing everybody a project I've been working on, this specific oracle deck, or study deck, or tarot deck of gods from mythologies around the world, synthesized and syncretized into 72 deity cards that are meant to resemble statues that could work into a pagan practice or fit into any regular tarot reading. I said I've been producing this deck for 6 months, but I've really been studying mythology, correlating different archetypes of deities for over 10 years, really. The Altar Oracle is like my magnum opus. There are 12 core zodiac signs and 12 cusp zodiac signs, and there's 3 deities per sign, so that's 24 times 3 equals 72. So here's the art. On the left, you'll see is actually about where the card would be. This is a demonstration of the incredible ability that we now have to generate backgrounds and even details in imagery using AI. In this case, generative fill from Photoshop. I was able to take the card and expand out to the entire space and generated this beautiful backdrop. I chose between a bunch of different ones and tweaked up a little bit of it to make it look right. We could animate these. We can have his eyes blink. We can have parts of his arms move. We can have this grass move. There's actually a video on my YouTube channel where we experimented with animation using AI art. But it showcases the potential of creating an entire world, in that case, a sea temple. Starting with Aries, we have Lazarus. It's taken from a Christian character who was resurrected by Jesus. Azael, or Azazel, a fallen angel, is something of an evil demon, may have related to Aziz, who's an old Arabian red horseman of war and travel. He protected caravans. And Azazel refers to a desolate place where a scapegoat was sent into the wild to essentially bear the sins of the people upon them. And so there is this motif of sacrifice. Tammuz and Dumuzid are Semitic shepherd gods. Dumuzid was chosen by Ishtar, or Inanna, to be her husband, and this relates in some ways to the Jewish story of Cain and Abel, since God holds a sort of contest between the two brothers where each presents him with a offering from their trade, Cain being the farmer and Abel being the shepherd. Now Dumuzid is not explicitly said to have a brother. He actually has a sister, Geshtinana, who is an agriculture deity, but he nonetheless ends up dying tragically. And Inanna is so distraught by this that she descends to the underworld in order to get him back. This story also relates to Adonis and Aphrodite. Adonis being related to Adon and Adonai in Canaanite and Hebrew mythology, although there are many different deities that syncretized into the Judeo-Christian god. Adonis in the Greek story is also a beautiful shepherd who is chosen by Aphrodite to be her husband. And he tragically dies, and she, along with Persephone, attempts to revive him. And that story, to me, also connects him with Aries, since Aries is the secret lover of Aphrodite. And it is said the very few times when Aphrodite and Aries are with one another that the world is a peaceful and harmonious place. Aries is away from war and channels his passions in a more healthy and humane way. To me, it is therefore interesting to kind of syncretize Aries and Adonis. Now, Aries and Mars are war gods, right? And as I've said in a few of my other videos, war gods are often, in my system, associated with Aries. But something I wanted to do in the Pandemonic pantheon is go beyond war and get into the heroism and the protective capacity that a god might represent. The ram which protects the flock. When we look at Martu or Amuru, who was the Amorite or Babylonian war god, we find the idea of a shepherd and ram symbology. They're a Semitic people that seems to have originated in Canaan and migrated down into Sumer and conquered it. The Akkadians before them were also a Semitic people from the upper Euphrates that came down and was enslaved by the Sumerians and then rebelled and overthrew and created an empire over the Sumerians before falling to the Gutians. But the Amorites come to establish Babylon. I believe they take over a temple and build the whole city of Babylon around it. The god of these Semitic people largely appears to have been this shepherd war god combo. And we see this also evidence in Amun of the Egyptian pantheon and Baal Hamon of later Punic or Carthaginian, which is really Phoenician pantheon. Also a Semitic people, also from Canaan. And where Amun gets to the Egyptians is probably through the Hyksos dynasty. Hyksos meaning shepherd kings. It's at that time that the cult of Amun-Ra spread throughout Egypt. In that case, Amun being syncretized with Ra really represents Ra essentially consenting to his rule. Because Ra essentially in Egypt has always represented the crown. He is the sun god and the sun is the crown. Ra, Osiris, and Horus were all considered to be aspects of Ra, the sun god, because they were all king. But this doesn't, in my system, mean that they're all the same deity. Rather, Amun is essentially just a later phase after Osiris and Horus. So Amun and Martu, being the shepherd gods, eventually kind of merged with these nearby ideas of like Baal and the thunder gods. And that's where there's something of a conflation between Zeus and Ammon, for instance, later in the Ptolemaic period. And some of these migrations might have been due to climate change. For instance, in the old record, the old biblical account of Joseph and all of his brothers, sons of Jacob, coming out of Canaan and migrating into Egypt in order to escape their famine, is likely a historical reference. The rough estimate of time where, say, Joseph would have lived roughly coincides with a period just before the Hyksos dynasty of Canaanites conquered Lower Egypt. Really what that's saying to me is that pastoralists and shepherds encountered difficulties and infertility in the land and a lack of rain. And so this deity came along to represent migration and conquest of other lands for better pastures. The idea that a shepherd coming upon hard times and in needing to defend his people and his flock would only then go to war, right? More of a Hector mentality rather than an Achilles mentality. You know, Hector of the Trojans defended his city and his people and his family from the invading conquerors of the Greeks, the Mycenaeans. Achilles being one of them, who was just a selfish, individualistic person who just wanted glory and power and didn't really think about what he was fighting for. And I always felt that a lot of the Aries motif and the Martian motif is very Achilles and not enough Hector. So this, I think, bridges something of that gap in that attitude. Another huge influence with this deity would be Tyr, who's the Norse war god who sacrificed his hand in order to wrestle Fenrir to be captured and brought to the underworld, you know, no longer wreaking havoc on people and, you know, their sheep. In my mythology, there's another card in here that I won't get into in this presentation, which represents a wolf-like trickster deity that is common throughout many mythologies around the world. His rival is essentially this trickster wolf deity who is trying to steal his sheep, thieve, and outmaneuver and outthink him. And a story of the shepherd and the wolf, right? Another very similar deity to Tyr is Nuada Ergetlem, Silver Hand. And I see in the depiction I did here, I tried to make sure his hand here, his right hand, was silver, glossy, artificial looking because he lost it and he had it rebuilt. And this is a motif throughout many myths. We see it in Star Wars, like very heavily sacrificing a piece of yourself when you're on your journey. You know, Luke loses his hand, Anakin loses his hand. And I see a lot of that really Anakin mentality here with Aries. There's potential for great disaster and Achilles and, you know, being the hero and being the best. And then there's the huge potential of being Hector and protecting your family, protecting your people, trying to bring about peace and justice for your new empire, right? He could have been so much more and so much greater. He could have been the highest ideal, but he settled for the lowest ideal of Aries, the lowest war god ideal. That's why here also I don't say war god of protection, war and heroism, or shepherdry and heroism. I said the shepherd god of protection. Sometimes war, if it's necessary. I think there's a tendency these days with all these superhero movies to take that Achilles and even that Hector mentality and just overdo it. Like, there's a lot of press on this particular archetype. The hero's journey, even, the monomyth, as it's said by Campbell, he never meant for it to be a monomyth in the sense that it's the only myth in existence. There are many different monomyths in existence that are very similar to other myths, but are not the same story. This story of triumphing over evil or protecting a group of people or, you know, anything involving conflict and strength and war in that sense, which is most of the media that we're fed in Hollywood these days. That's just one story. You know, not everything revolves around fighting and punching somebody and defeating evil people, right? Despite that, I still find this a very interesting and deep and meaningful archetype. So Nuada was a hero, one of the first kings of the Tuatha De Danann, who, fighting in a war, lost his arm, and there's a tradition with the Tuatha De Danann that if you're king, you had to basically be physically perfect. So having his arm decapitated made him unfit to rule, and he was replaced by a young, beautiful new king, Bress, who was put in place by Balor, who is the evil eye, actually some of the basis of Sauron to some degree in Lord of the Rings. So in that, there's almost something of like a beautiful form of Sauron who's like trying to take over the kingdom. Nuada works with the craftsman, I believe, to craft him a new arm or a new hand of silver. In so doing, he takes back the kingship, and then there's a civil war between them and the Fomorians of Bress and Balor. So in that story, it doesn't involve a wolf per se, it's just a regular war, but there's still this idea of sacrificing and having to redeem oneself and prove oneself a warrior regardless. I wanted to bring up Hachiman in here of the Japanese traditions because he ultimately became a war god to the Bushido samurai tradition. And Bushido is essentially a Shinto Buddhist, sort of martial Shinto Buddhist sect from Japan that was worshipped or the practice or the tradition of samurai largely. Hachiman kind of identified the perfect samurai. But something really interesting about him and nuanced about him is that before this martial samurai Buddhist tradition came in, he might have actually been something of a rural, agricultural, or possibly even shepherd deity. A deity that was masculine, but without needing to go to war in order to prove its masculinity. This later Buddhist martial idea put armor all over him. It's something that's kind of interesting in The Last Samurai movie, which I very much enjoy, that showcases the samurai in a more nuanced manner where they're also devoted to the perfection of many arts and farming, and sure, they pursue military perfection, but they also live upon the land and by the land. That's another aspect of this motif that, again, in line with the Hectors and the Demusids and such. Essentially, like, stereotypically the perfect man, right? So another deity I put in here I wanted to mention is Taurus. And Taurus, kind of namesake of the Teutons, might have also been one of the main gods of the Anglians from originally Denmark, who then became Anglo-Saxon English. Taurus is considered and integrated into Celtic pantheons around Germany and France and Britain, as well as Germanic ones around the Rhine River. He's essentially a god of unification and of the people. To some extent, the name Tuatha De Danann, which means the people of Danann, Danann being Danu, a goddess that I will mention actually when we get to Cancer. Tuatha, in that meaning people, kind of relates to this to Tatis. He's a god of the tribes. He's of communication, organization, as well as war. So more nuanced than simply a war god, like, say, the Teutonic Knights essentially represented much later in the medieval era to some extent. Not to say that those are the same people, per se. Another linguistic interest here is Taurus represents the quintessential tutelary god, like a specific place or people or tribe is protected by this deity. And Taurus, like Lazarus here, I thought could represent all people, every tribe, every group, every locality. Every culture has their war gods, and every culture is praying to their war god against the other war god, right? What's interesting is they're all basically praying to the same motif, to the same idea. And if we were to look at it that way and see that they're all fighting for the same thing and relate to each other in that way, maybe we would have a lot less fighting in the world. And the last little reference I'm going to make to Chrysobalos, who is the ram of the Aries constellation. He's the ram whose hide became the golden fleece because he was a golden ram. Not only gold literally in the Greek myth, but he was also gold spiritually because he was a hero who saved the twins Phrixus and Heli from their conniving stepmother who sought to drown them in the sea. Took both of them from there and flew them to the other side of the Black Sea, to Georgia, to Colchis, which is how the Golden Fleece got there later when, in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, they go to retrieve it. When Phrixus sacrifices the golden ram in thanks to the gods for rescuing him, he is sent to the heavens, to Zeus in that sense, to become the constellation of Aries. And I thought I would bring that in there because that just quintessentially represents this heroism that I'm getting at. And with that, I think I could probably move on to the next one. So the next card that I'll be showing for Taurus is the Earth Mother Gaia. And Gaia is a very common and well-renowned and accepted goddess for many cultures today. So like Gaia is one in the Pandemonium pantheon that is already regularly worshipped by modern pagan movements. And I try where I can to integrate those types of things where there's a deity that is regularly worshipped, or that's at least widely recognized, even from a secular perspective. Even on like Earth Day, it wouldn't be crazy for someone to pray to Gaia or to mention Gaia in some manner, or to speak of the Earth as the Earth Mother. The Earth Mother motif is also just a general motif that is common to virtually every culture on Earth. Usually Earth Mother and Sky Father. I'll get to the Sky Father later when we get to Aquarius. Gaia essentially represents motherhood and nature and family. And Gaia comes from the Greek earth goddess, who is related to many of the Mesopotamian earth goddesses, Ki and Kishar, for instance. Ki, I think, being Sumerian and Kishar being, I think, Assyrian. Again, often coupled with a Sky Father. In Norse, there's Gertha or Jord, who are treated as two separate deities, but really were probably something of the same deity from different traditions in Norse. Gertha relates directly to Earth. There's also, I don't have it here, I don't think, Egyptian goddess Hathor, who's like a cow goddess. Another word for her is Wartha, which As you can see, linguistically, it's very similar to Goethe and Earth. Obviously, in our English language today, when we say Earth, it might come from a Germanic basis in this Goethe word, or even in the word Jord, which evolves into world, right? Going way back to the Neolithic and to the Middle East, and also to Judeo-Christian influence over Europe. Gauri, Uma, Bhumi are some more names for some Hindu earth goddess deities. In the Hindu system, the largest and longest lasting pagan polytheistic religion on earth, they often have certain motifs that they conflate many different deities into, and they take deities from other pantheons and they say, oh, I see you're a manifestation, you're a avatar of, say, Parvati or Shakti or Shiva or Vishnu, right? They have a core of deities that are often kind of conflated with other deities in order to help the system kind of rein in all of its diversity. This is an instance where I go forth and do that as well, with Gauri, Uma, and Bhumi all being earth goddesses. Terra is the Roman one. It's where we get the alternative kind of sci-fi name for Earth, Terrans, like Atira of the Pawnee. And the Pawnee are a Catalan culture in the upper Missouri River region, Nebraska and Kansas and such. They have an Earth Mother, and there's a lot of Amerindian deities that in their English translation are simply Earth Mother. I prefer to try to take the actual words in the languages of those people to describe the deity, just like we do for every other culture on Earth. But of course, all of them are basically Earth Mother and open to interpretation. In that sense, they're open to syncretization with an idea. There are times where their ideas, especially when we get to Skyfather, are being muddled and assimilated into a Christian worldview, not only theirs, but in Africa and in East Asia and so many other colonized cultures. God is conflated with almost every one of their Skyfathers, and many of their more nuanced characteristics are just kind of supplanted or ignored and saying, oh no, you're just God. See, assimilation is not the same as syncretization. It's not the same as exchange. What I'm trying to do here is show a multifaceted idea that has many different manifestations throughout many different cultures, and create a depthful deity that has all of those aspects in mind and is balanced by all the other aspects in every other deity. Even in a lot of neo-pagan movements these days, we tend to settle for 3 deities. Some people tend to worship only one or a few. And there's Dimu of the Chinese, relating back to that kind of Qi Shar, Qi Gi idea of earth. This relates to Dagon, who's the Proto-Indo-European Earth Mother, which is a reconstructed name. It's not what name we know for certain that they said was the Earth Mother. It's just a reconstructed proto-language name, and evolves into Zemele and different kind of plays on that. Papa is a Polynesian and Hawaii Earth goddess as well, and sounds a lot like Pachamama of Incan, as well as another Earth Mother of creation. Aberewa is an Akan, essentially Nigerian Earth goddess, that I think is also called Asaseya, and is somewhat still influential in pagan movements of like Santeria and Voodoo and such in the Caribbean today. I have a little suspicion that maybe the fictional fantasy goddess Ewa of the Avatar by the Blue Navi people might relate in some way to this Aberewa. They certainly seem to have been influenced by some Nigerian African language with some of the Navi inspirations. And then we have Amalur of the Basque. The Basque are a very interesting culture in Europe. They don't fit into the Indo-European categories. Our most conservative estimates is that their language goes back to the Neolithic farmer settlers of Spain that came from Anatolia and the Levant, probably even Tartessian, which is a language and ethnic group that kind of died out or was integrated by the Phoenicians when they started to colonize southern Spain. But they're an interesting example of, yet again, this idea that the Earth Mother goes back very far. There seems to be a trend that happens with Indo-European research where people assume that it's basically the oldest linguistic commonality that any culture has. I don't think it's anywhere near possible to argue that Proto-Indo-European Earth Mother Dagom was the first Earth Mother, and it's the oldest language, or it's the mother tongue of humanity, and that's not true at all. There are many different language groups that are not Indo-European, and there are some language groups like Finno-Ugric that are more closely related to Indo-European than to other languages, and some people argue Altaic languages might be related a little closer as well, although that's not proven. So there's all these different language groups that are not directly related to Indo-European, and which have their own names for Earth Mother and Sky Father and Thunder Gods, which actually bear resemblance to one another. And that's not because they are all Proto-Indo-European influenced. It's because there is a linguistic commonality, or many sets of them that go back way further to even deeper roots than whatever is Proto-Indo-European. It'd be proto. I would definitely argue that the sort of linguistics behind someone like Ki and Kishar of Mesopotamian, or Gaia, or even Goethe of Norse, goes further back linguistically than Dagom does in the Eurasian steppe. If Earth Mother and Sky Father is something that's worshipped a very long time ago, like say with the Venus figurines that are found throughout Europe and much of the world, all the way into the Mesolithic, they are essentially depictions of an Earth Mother. If language goes as far back as the Mesolithic, or far before that, which I would say it most likely does, then there might be a gi or ki or d sort of word or linguistic commonality that started back then and then influenced the Indo-Europeans in the steppe. My sign, Gemini. One of the three deities of Gemini is Curios. And I take this from, I guess, many influence, really, primarily Mercurius of the Romans and Hermes. But I liked how it represents curiosity in itself, this messenger god of intellect and writing, communication, as well as commerce and travel. Hermodir is also the messenger god of the Norse. Hermodir, at least the Hermo part of his name, might have been something of a loan from, that would be Roman influence, like integration with Germanic deities, Germanic, Celtic, and Roman deities, for instance. There's a lot of conflation of the Romans, for instance, between Mercury and Odin, and the Germanic word Woden. When the Romans saw Odin, they didn't have quite a place for them because they recognize Thor and Thunor as something of a Zeus-like figure. They saw Odin as a wanderer, and his madness as a sign of intellect and of wisdom. And Odin also was seen as a ferryman of the dead across the sky, essentially. Hermes and Mercury are also given the role of a ferryman of the dead. They escort dead souls from their bodies to the underworld and then give them to Charon, the old man, who then takes them across the river Styx into the actual underworld. And so they looked at Odin and Woden in this sort of Mercurian way and often conflated him with them. I don't do that because I have a different place for Woden, but I admit that there is a Mercury influence with the Odin deity in my pantheon. I'll tell you, he is Odin. I put in the cusp of Corvus between Libra and Virgo, 4 signs. So in that case, the character Wanderos or Vanderos, who is the pandemonic name for that Odin character. And so Hermodir, almost something of a mix between Hermes and Odin, was maybe something of a another translation. One of the most widely understood, I guess, syncretisms in history is between Mercury, Hermes, and Thoth. Thoth being the Egyptian god of writing and wisdom, and also himself kind of a scribe and a judge in the underworld of people's deeds. The Ptolemaic Greeks, so that's under Ptolemy, who was one of Alexander's generals, who was given rulership over Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. established a dynasty there in Egypt and began to syncretize Greek deities with local Egyptian deities and came up with a very diverse and interesting and dynamic pantheon. Really quite the inspiration for me working on this Pandemonic pantheon is how interesting and nuanced a lot of the myths that came out of Ptolemaic Egypt merged different identities in very unique and interesting ways. And one of the most inspiring for me is this synthesis of Mercury, Hermes, and Thoth. Hermes Trismegistus, down at the bottom, which means Hermes thrice greatest, is a very profoundly important personality within the occultic traditions. And essentially, he is the founder of the tarot and also of writing itself. He's related to the Book of Thoth, which is this, again, this kind of book of life. One way to think of it is that when Thoth is writing his book of life for every individual in the afterlife, this book isn't made up of all the minutiae and details of everyone's life. It's not written for every individual. It's a book of archetypes and ideals and stories that can be identified with any person in any lifetime. He was able to, I guess, decide whether people were worthy or unworthy of those standards and those ideals. It's a very interesting mix of that kind of afterlife obsession of the Egyptians and then the virtuous philosophical obsession, I guess, of the Greeks. Well, Metatron in the Gnostic Christian traditions is considered the scribe of God, who holds on to the book of life that again is used to judge every person when they die. And that also fits with kind of what we're talking about here. And so the story goes that this book was lost and secretly compiled or cut up into 78 cards that represented those 78 archetypes and of ideas and of story beats that represent the whole of human experience. This not only evolved into tarot cards and oracle cards as they're used today in divination, but also into regular playing cards. You know, you have the same kind of motifs going on. Playing cards take out the trump cards, they take out the major arcana, and they only have the kind of numbered cards, the four elements of like hearts, spades, and so on, correlated to the swords, wands, and so on. All of those representing the four elements: fire, earth, air, and water. Then you have the king, the queen, the page, and the knight. How this relates to Curios is that it represents more than just writing. It represents philosophy and categorization and classification. Through using tarot cards and divination, you can understand and comprehend and reflect upon yourself and who you are and where you're at. Make meaning of your life. It's quite fitting that I would be the one to come out with this deck of deities to do divination and tarot and oracle in the way that I'm doing here in this video, because I'm hermetic. I'm coming from a hermetic tradition of a messenger god and essentially channeling the messenger god of curiosity right now before you by presenting these ideas and these archetypes that anyone can identify with. It's kind of meta right now. It's like this is the deity that shows the deities, essentially. So moving on, Nabu would be the Akkadian and Mesopotamian god of writing and basically civilization in many ways. He's also the inspiration between the planet Naboo. Star Wars. I know I'm mentioning Star Wars a few times now. I don't know. It's just coming up. Naboo's architecture in Star Wars comes from some mixing with a Roman and Greek sort of influence. It's a very scholarly, scribal looking place. It's quite fitting, I think, for the character of Gemini and of the messenger god and Nabu. Hayagriva is also an interesting deity of Vedic Hindu tradition. He's depicted as a horse or having the horse head, and he's also described in some sources as having a other half, a evil twin. An evil twin or aspect of himself stole the four Vedas from Brahma and wanted to keep them from humankind. Hayagriva comes to represent writing and wisdom. Perhaps he's integrated that evil half to become a good and wise god who seeks to spread knowledge throughout the world. And that aspect of the horses there makes sense because horses are for traveling. And so often a lot of twin deities, like even Castor and Pollux and the Roman and Greek tradition, are considered horsemen, essentially. So there's the motif there of the twins, which again correlates with Gemini and the twins motif of the constellation. And often the twins in many cultures, I'm not going to go into all of them because that would be a whole video unto its own, but they often represent two horsemen if they're based on Indo-European tradition, like Hayagriva is, because horses are an Indo-European innovation, essentially. And then another one that I guess I struggle with a little bit is Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrian tradition. Now, so much of Ahura Mazda is Aquarian or is a sky father, because so many sky fathers are at the head of a pantheon, far and away and abstract and good, fundamentally good or benevolent. And so he certainly fits with a lot of that motif. But since Ahura Mazda is something of a synthesis, a byproduct of the philosophical thinking during the Axial Age of Zoroaster in Persia, who is taking the Persian pagan mythology and, in a similar way to Hermes Trismegistus, boil all of it down to several archetypes, several ideas, several different concepts. And Zoroastrianism is a very conceptual and philosophical and Gnostic religion. You can speak of every deity in their pantheon as a concept, as an idea, and it wouldn't be sacrilegious to do so. They are like an ideal that you're striving for. So in many ways, a lot of the pantheon I'm building here is fairly Zoroastrian in its ethos of like, these are manifestations, these are ideals, these are archetypes to be embodied. And so I felt like overall, on top of the idea that another word for Ahura Mazda is Hormaz and Urumazd, and it kind of sounds like Hermes, which I know is like a stretch, but there's something of him and his context to Zoroastrianism as the main good deity, opposed to the main evil deity, Angra Mainyu, that is as though Hermes was speaking to the people and trying to lead them in a virtuous direction through this writing of a new philosophy, a new religion. Now, another theme is in line with so many other deities across the world. Triptolemus is a very obscure god of Attican Greeks. And so Attican would be like the original Athenians, so like the people who lived around Athens, that founded Athens. And the Attican tradition goes all the way back possibly to the Mycenaeans, or possibly the rest of the Aegean, maybe all the way back to the Pelasgian or Helladic people. Triptolemus worked with Demeter and I believe Harmonia or Persephone at the time to spread agriculture and to spread civilization and to teach people how to live in cities and how to farm the land and how to use all these new Neolithic technologies that they had. Demeter, of course, we'll get to her being essentially the mother goddess of the Neolithic, spreading, agriculture and being the primary head of the gods during the agricultural expansion of the Neolithic. Triptolemus was like the proselytizing priest of this Neolithic movement. And he was portrayed in a chariot with wings. This kind of resembles Hermes in a lot of ways, with his, winged feet. Ultimately, he would be conflated with Hermes, but so much of that original traveling, enlightening deity was like kind of lost over time. Later on, when Zeus became leader of the pantheon rather than like Demeter, Zeus probably stemming from a more Indo-European source of the Mycenaeans or later peoples. Hermes evolved into just a kind of son of Zeus who was just a messenger of Olympus rather than this extremely important personality. Very similar deity to the Mayans is Kukulkan. And Kukulkan, interestingly, was brought up in the most recent Black Panther movie, the second one. Or maybe he had, another name, but was deified and had Kukulkan's traits projected upon him. He is shown in the movie with hermetic feet, and that's really interesting. So Kukulkan is also a teacher who spread civilization and taught the people to worship and to build temples, and was considered a traveler. How he got this wisdom is very interesting as well, because he was devoured by the cosmic serpent, the rainbow serpent of the Mayans, similar to Quetzalcoatl of the Aztecs. Kukulkan is not identified directly with this rainbow serpent, but instead is depicted inside the mouth of this serpent. It's not that Kukulkan is this alien power coming in, ancient alien bullshit. Instead, Kukulkan is a member of the Mayan people who is heroic enough, brave enough, and enlightened enough to go into the mouth of the serpent, this dangerous entity, and submit himself to it and try to integrate the wisdom of that dragon. And that's a motif that goes into so many myths and stories, integrating the dragon, integrating the monster, right? And finding profound wisdom with that. Serpents often represent great wisdom or great fear. The cultures that fear snakes and serpents or outright demonize them, they're afraid of questions. They're afraid of diversity, polytheism, and free thought. They want people to believe in a set of sins and rules. Going outside of that and thinking for yourself, the idea of integrating a demon, of integrating your shadow, recognizing yourself in a monster, is very antithetical. That is considered satanic. That is considered evil and corrupting, right? Cultures that are able to understand the wisdom of the serpent are the ones that are truly able to evolve and become enlightened. And so that's a good lesson there, I think, that Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl represent. Bochica and Viracocha are two other deities that, in the Muisca and Incan cultures respectively, represent a civilizing teacher who is essentially an enlightened ruler, an enlightened monarch of their respective people. Bochica in the Muisca is very peaceful and essentially utopic. He wants the best for his people. And there's a time, for instance, where he's at war with the thunder god, and he's betrayed even by the moon goddess. Ultimately, he kind of overcomes that resistance. And unlike in so many other pantheons around the world, he actually succeeds against the thunder god. Because in so many other pantheons, the thunder god, at his worst, is a tyrannical, strong jock, essentially, who just beats everybody into submission, like Zeus. And later on, tried to justify all of his actions and his conquests by saying that he was a liberator and that the previous ruler, Kronos in that case, was a tyrant. And there's this twisting of the idea. Viracocha, similarly, is kind of the creator god of the Incan people in Lake Titicaca. Essentially tried to set them up well and wanted them to be successful and happy and artful and to create and to be beautiful and happy. And there were ways in which they kind of disappointed him ultimately. And he kind of just left. Essentially, it's as though he left and said, I'm going to go start with someone else. His son Inti, the sun god, comes in and finds something redeemable about these people and leads them to become the golden Incan empire that they eventually become under Manco Capac. And then throwing in a few other varieties in here, we have Caviria of Georgian and Kulmis of the Permian being a Finno-Ugric language. These are deities that represent a little bit almost like two tatis in the last one, tribal unification and communication and organization. As a messenger god, they represent the bridge between the divine world of ideas and perfections and ideals and the human world of action and practice. They represent not just communication between the gods and man, but also between people. And all of this together fits into, I think, a diverse and fascinating deity. It's very worth striving for, and I certainly try to strive for a lot of these ideals in my own personal life, and I'm trying it out right here in this by doing this YouTube channel. And talking about these deities and trying to put this oracle deck out there. I'm hoping to communicate something to people and help the conversation get started about these types of interesting things. Next we have Cancer. Diana essentially as a name means the goddess. I decided to take Diana straight from the Roman source of what a Cancer deity represents, a reflection of feminine principle, in a similar kind of way to how I was talking about Lazarus and his masculine ideals. This is a feminine ideals, let's say. Here again, every sign has 3 deities. There's usually an elder, and then there's 2 younger deities, a male and a female. The elder version of the Cancer deity is Lunara, who is more directly a moon goddess and more ethereal and abstract in that sense. Diana is more grounded. She has to do with wilderness and animal protection and protection of innocence, really, and even one's own innocence. And in that sense represents insight and intuition. All these aspects that I know are very popular in the pagan and divination or tarot community. The goddess term has many different forms throughout the world. Dione, it's considered a Greco-Roman goddess who is something of a oracle. She presided over the oracle at Dodona, and Dodona is in Epirus, which is like essentially modern Albania. It's the homeland of the Dorians, who later invade Greece and spread culture and deities throughout Greece, although they are still a Hellenic culture. So this Dione deity might have actually evolved into the Diana Roman form of Artemis, which is the Greek name for her. Phoebe is another Greek deity that's very similar to this. Phoebe was considered to be the first oracle of Delphi, and who was later replaced by Apollo in that position. Apollo, being a sun god, shows that there was a kind of a shift from matriarchal oracle to a patriarchal oracle. This is further evidence if we look deeper into the accounts of Apollo's defeat of the dragon Python, who in alternative accounts is Delphine, the namesake of Delphi, a chthonic serpentine goddess of wisdom, who whispered oracles to the Pythia. Fun fact, the intoxicating gas produced in a cavern under the sanctuary at Delphi is likely responsible for the importance of the site and its use for divination. Serpentine imagery is common throughout psychedelic experiences in many cultures. In the Apollonian tradition, a lot of oracle readings have to do with the future and prophecy, and one might entertain the possibility that the older oracles based on the moon had more to do with personal insight and connection with the divine or with nature and so on. And there's another deity, or again concept, because many Zoroastrian deities can be considered concepts since they're so conceptual. Dana means in Zoroastrian the concept of insight and revelation, and that connects as well to this Dione sort of oracle that's trying to connect with our deep inner self. What's fascinating to me about what the moon ought to represent in astrology as well as in mythology and so on is it represents reflection. The moon is reflecting the sun when we see a white moon. And so there's the conscious experience of every day, which is essentially the sun, but the moon represents the subconscious, and the subconscious is kind of reflecting the conscious within our downtime, at night, in our sleep, in our meditation, when we close our eyes, when we're trying to tap into something deeper inside of ourselves. To get away from that particular wording, we have Artemis of Greek. We also have Ilargi of the Basque. Basque is a very unique and interesting culture that gives us a lens of what is a alternative perspective in Europe to the mainstream Indo-European perspective. Then we have Arinyani of Hindu. All 3 of these goddesses represent protection of the wilderness and are associated with animals, and sometimes with the hunt, and often with the night hunt as well, though usually they are in defense of nature against man's encroachment. There's many stories of Artemis cursing or killing hunters that trespass in her sacred groves. In my video on the Hittite gods, I mentioned Kurunta, the wild man god who rebelled against the thunder god in the Hittite pantheon. His partner was Alawani, and in Hurrian is Inara, a goddess of wild animals. Thana, an Illyrian wild animal goddess of Pannonia, also has a counterpart in Videsis, another similar wild man and steward of the forest, himself related to Sylvestris, Sylvanus, Silenos, and Pan, whose very name may have referred to the region of the Danube where he originated, in Pannonia. Now, this Kurunta Pan deity is a service deity in our pantheon, named Elvanos, and we'll talk about him in another video. But could he be Actaeon, the shepherd hunter of the woods who Artemis transformed into a stag for intruding upon her grove? Could this have been a change in the story so as to oppose the two to one another when originally they were united against civilization? In my previous video on the messenger god, I mentioned the moon goddess who aids a thunder god in overthrowing Bochica of the Muisca, a supposedly enlightened and, quote, civilized deity. Her name is Chia, or Huitaka, and she has come to represent witchcraft, sexual liberation, music, the arts, and opposition to patriarchy. From this perspective, we might look at Bochica a bit more critically and recognize the aspects of civilization which we might better be free from. This rebellious Dianic motif is common with moon goddesses and huntresses from around the globe, like with Mayari, a Filipina hunting moon goddess who contests with the sun god Apalaki, similar to Apollo and Artemis, over rulership of the Philippines. Then we have Danu and Denan and Devana. Specifically, it's interesting that in Balinese, which is in Indonesia, influenced by Indian Hindu culture, also Danu of Irish, they're all named Danu, and they all have similar motifs. Now, of course, all of those are related to an Indo-European root again. The Indo-European root of Da in these cases usually refers to water. This takes a slight turn from a sort of insight motif, although I think they are very related, metaphorically and archetypally speaking, water and reflection, right? Water and the moon, the cycles and the ebb and flow and the tides. And in Hinduism, Danu is a matriarch of the Danavas, who are an entire set of deities. And whenever you have a name for a group of deities, is essentially a record of when different cultures came into an area, started depositing their worldview, let's say, their set of deities and their language influence. In that case, the Danavas might have actually been referring to the Indo-Europeans, or maybe some group of Indo-Europeans, possibly. There's a similar group that goes into Ireland that is called the Tuatha De Danann that we talked about, the people of Danann. Danann being another term for Danu, the goddess of the Irish, who again represents darkness and water. And she has kind of an opposite, which is Anna. And Anna represents in Irish, similar to Aini, is light and summer. And this also is a reference to the fact that these Danann probably came from across the sea, from Europe, most likely the Indo-European settlers of Ireland from the rest of Britain, and then furthermore from Europe, spreading Celtic culture into the British Isles. The Balinese goddess Danu is also said to have come from afar over the sea. This is kind of a proof of that pattern happening, because we know that Hindus came from India and settled Indonesia, especially the island of Java, and then eventually the Balinese islands, and spread this deity that is literally a Hindu deity, Danu. But it became renewed in that sense of, like, not only did Danu represent the deity that the Hindus represented it as in their tradition, but it came to represent in Bali the Hindus coming to their island. Another interesting possibility here is that these Danu names might refer to the Danube River, and therefore to the Danubian culture that spread out from the Danube River, which would include Italic people, Celtic people, Thracian, Dacian, Phrygian. Devana is another deity that connects the Danu sort of linguistics to Artemis and Elargi, because she's the Slavic goddess of the hunt and wild animals and forests. And some more evidence for this connection between the river of the Danube and this Artemis Diana type figure is Serbian deity Yana. And Serbian is a South Slavic or Yugoslavic language and ethnic group. So in this case, they are related to Devana, but they settled in the Danube Valley. Serbia is right on the Danube River, and therefore might have integrated and syncretized some local deities of the Illyrian peoples before them to create their brand of deities. A local deity, like, say, Thana, who is the Illyrian Artemis, essentially, becomes the sometimes with linguistic evolution. Then there's Zana, who's this Albanian deity of wilderness. And Albanian is essentially the oldest Illyrian language that still exists. Albanian is still Indo-European culture, but it's not purely Greek and not purely Italic and not purely, let's say, Celtic or other. Zana indicates a tradition or a name or a deity that would have been common to the area that Serbia was in when the Yugoslavs came down and started settling in the Danube and meeting these other cultures like the Albanians and Illyrians, and they're all saying that's the goddess of the river, of the Danube River, and having it be similar themes to their own Devana confirms that maybe these things are connected, and maybe it's not all coincidence. Then we have other protectress, huntress, moon goddesses like Satis in Egyptian, who's like a defender of the southern region, to be Upper Egypt. And we have Hastiotoi, who's a goddess of wilderness and the hunt to the Dinah, who also called the Navajo more popularly. They're part of the Athabascan language family in America, who actually have another culture they're related to in Siberia. The only well-proven link between the old world and the new world in terms of linguistics, other than, say, the Inuit who arrived in the Americas in the Arctic much later. But she fits the bill. And also just general goddesses like Jana in Roman, who is really kind of a different version of Diana that might go back a little further in their tradition, possibly to Etruscan roots, who represents the moon phases and the months themselves in that sort of calendrical organization of life. Jana's counterpart is Janus. People say Janus faced when they're referring to Janus, who has two faces and is a guardian of doorways in Roman mythology. So both Janus and Jana represent the astrology of, I guess, calendars or of ritual and tradition, and kind of reminds me of many old traditions that are a moon-based calendar, right? So the lunar calendar of China, for instance, is a moon-based calendar. And there are many other cultures that had a moon-based calendar before the current Gregorian calendar, right? Mostly solar calendar based. And I think it's kind of a misnomer to say that, because there are aspects of lunar cycles in our calendar, the Gregorian calendar that the Western world mostly uses today. It's not really true to say that there's a lunar calendar that's just totally a different thing, and then there's a solar calendar. Both calendars have systems which overlap with one another. I mean, we have months, and they're based on moons. And I also wanted to throw in here Kagami, a Japanese kami associated with mirrors, and in that sense with reflection again. It actually reminds me of the Mirror of Galadriel that is in Lord of the Rings, that Frodo uses to reflect and basically do divination. It's not events that are going to come to pass. It's ideas about events that are possible and that the current user, in this case Frodo, is projecting into the imagery. It's like a dream. You're essentially giving yourself a deep connective dream. Similar kind of thing happens with the Harry Potter series with the pensieve that they have, where they put their memories and then can see them back. But that's a bit more literal in that magic system, where you put in a memory and you can literally see the memory as it happens. It's less of divination. So here we go, a deity with many aspects that are extremely meaningful and quite useful when certainly doing divination, representing archetypes and characters and stories. So now we come to Leo and Solara, the sun goddess, the provider, The sun goddess is a motif that is actually quite common to almost every mythology. The sun is very important for humans in the history of life on Earth, really. So, of course, it's going to have very important impact on our philosophical and linguistic understanding. What I find really interesting about this pandemonic deity of Solara is in line with the heliocentric view. The sun and really every star in the universe is a mother. And from a scientific perspective, the metaphor of a sun goddess is actually more fitting, arguably, than a sun god, which often sun gods get more press and they're more popular. But a sun goddess makes more sense. All the elements in existence are crafted, are conceived in the belly of stars. And it's through their sacrifice from generation to generation of going supernova and spreading the elements throughout the universe that we get more and more complex elements and eventually more complex forms of matter and eventually life. So to me, I think there should be more recognition of Solar as an important deity, as an important archetype in contemporary neo-paganism. I get the name obviously from our name for our sun, which is Sol, and that takes from a Roman and Norse source of Sol. The Roman Sol is actually later in the Roman Empire called Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun, and is a masculine form. Would be one of the other two Leo deities, Lucifer. In the Norse system, Sol is a sun goddess who processes around the world every day, who is followed by the moon, her brother, Mani. And Sol, as a name, comes from an Indo-European probable source, with Sehu is the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European. I say Pi there, Proto-Indo-European. And the Baltic states, not including Estonia, since Estonian is more related to Finno-Ugric, Latvian, Lithuanian, and even originally Prussian are all considered Baltic languages and Baltic cultures. And they actually linguistically, especially the Lithuanians, I've noticed, have some of the closest linguistic connections to the original Indo-European people. And Lithuania is so underappreciated also, historically speaking. Sunna, of course, our name for sun, is the same deity. It's a Germanic deity that passed through us through the Anglo-Saxon roots of English. Tihi is the Chinese sun goddess. And there's an interesting tale of hers. She had 10 crows as sons. And each of them was like its own sun and wreaked havoc on the world, creating, famine, overheating everything. Hao Yi, the great archer, was allowed to shoot down all of the crows and leaving only one to remain as the sun god. We'll find that it's related to many myths and many different stories. Like in the Hindu Ramayana, when Rama takes on the 10-headed wicked king Ravana, a coincidentally raven-like trickster depicted in black with wings. Crows and ravens are both corvids. They tend to be wise and cunning trickster spirits in many legends. Saranyu would be the Vedic Hindu sun goddess, opposite to Surya. We then have Yi and Wala and Bila of different Aboriginal tribes throughout Australia. And the sun goddess is a very important high deity for that pantheon as well. Sometimes, in the case of Bila, she is somewhat malevolent. She would be burning people and cooking them and then eating them, basically just terrorizing everybody. I took a break while editing to watch some Star Trek The Next Generation, and just so happened to catch the episode Masks, featuring an alien sun goddess, Musaka, who possesses Data along with other mythological characters. Musaka is described as wrathful, causing drought and thirst. Picard has to channel the moon god Corgano in order to put her to sleep and bring about night. Since this culture seems to have gone extinct, one might suggest that their planet was scorched by its own sun, and this mythological metaphor is their way of explaining what might have happened to them. As for Yi, she is actually a creatrix, so she created the universe. She created life and allowed things to grow. And so there's a kind of duality here with the sun quite often, is that too much sun leads to drought and overheating and desertification. Just the right amount of sun leads to growth and new life. Often these are quite benevolent deities, but again, there's the two-sidedness that can also come with it. Then we get to Erina, who is, in my last video, queen of the Hittite pantheon. In that sense, represents the centralizing and kind of unifying force that the sun and that a sun deity has, in line with a heliocentric model of the solar system. This central sun figure being the queen or the king and representing the crown to some extent. I mentioned Ainina, who's a Georgian goddess of light, who might be related to that Erina, and then also kind of related linguistically potentially to this Aini, Irish goddess of light and the summer. Aini, again, kind of related to Anna, or Anan, who is sometimes considered an epithet or another aspect of Danan or Danu, from what we were just talking about with Cancer. One meaning dark and one meaning light. And in this case here, one represented by the moon and the other represented by the sun. And I talked about how in Norse, but it's also true with Wala and Aboriginal and other deities, the sun goddess is flying across the sky, chasing or being chased by the moon god. And that's very common throughout Amerindian mythology as well, like with Melina in the Inuit. Then we have deities like Nepanya, which, opposite of Nepatia, Atia and Anya in Hungarian, refer to a god or goddess in their mythology. Both sun deities in this case, or Biwi or Biv of Sami mythology, so that's up in northern Finland. They're the ones that ranch reindeer. Amaterasu is probably one of the most popular sun deities in the world. You'd probably say the most worshipped to this day, because Shinto tradition, even if somewhat secular in Japan, is still widely practiced or widely adhered to or widely respected or referred to. So Amaterasu actually goes back and represents the original Neolithic peoples living in Japan who had a matriarchal society, we could say, or at the very least, their priest class was female. Amaterasu kind of represents a deified high priestess. She was a bridge between gods and mankind, and was, like Erina, this sort of centralizing force. So really the monarchies in Japan first began with something like Amaterasu, the matriarchal shamanic queens. Hemera might relate to all this by being a Greek goddess of day, and often day is another way to refer to the sun, right? And summer. Then we have another old example I wanted to take from the Middle East a little bit, Sapash, which is a Phoenician, Ugaritic, I think, sun goddess, opposite to Shamash, who's a Semitic sun god. So again, often these sun deities, they have a male and a female, and often they are wedded to or sister of, even brother of, in terms of Apollo and Artemis, another moon god. And now we get to Virgo with Surya. And Surya is a very fitting name. It's taken from Ceres, which is not only a planet, a dwarf planet in the asteroid belt, but also a Roman deity, the goddess of farming and agriculture and the harvest. Ceres and Surya have a root in the same word for cereals. And cereals means grains and grasses and, you know, bread and all these things that were advanced by the West Asian Neolithic, probably by the Natufians of Canaan, around contemporary Syria. And so the name for Syria, the country and the area, comes from the homeland of cereals, essentially. This is around where Göbekli Tepe is, and also around some of the first farming villages that we have record of on Earth. They were experimenting with cereals of various kinds. That would be wheat, barley, rye. I believe rye was the first one that they started making into breads. But on top of this experimentation, they were also doing alcohol. Alcohol was a vital part of this Neolithic expansion as well. It was a big innovation. Goddesses like Ninkasi of Sumerian were associated directly with alcohol and were called upon to kind of bless your brewing. Mythologically, were thought to have brewed all of the alcohol consumed by the gods. Linlil most likely was to be identified with this Ninkasi character as well, another Sumerian name for this queen of the gods who was the wife of Enlil. And like in the last video of the Hittites I talked about, I brought up Elil, which is a version of Enlil. Elil being associated with Capricorn. Often the Capricorn agricultural deity is partnered with the Virgo agricultural deity, in this case, Syria. So the Capricorn or the Romans and Greeks, for instance, would be Kronos and Saturnus, and we'll get to that later when we get to Capricorn. But as you can see here, Rhea is the Greek wife of Kronos. Rhea represents and is often depicted again seated on a throne representing the Golden Age. And Kronos, Capricorn, often represented by gold and wealth and fortune, refers to this golden age as well. So again, these two are kind of coupled, Virgo and Capricorn, thematically. So Ceres and Shalash are some Syrian Semitic deities that are essentially the namesake of their homeland and the namesake of what they represent as agricultural deities, which they were. The Romans later, when they conquered Syria, referred to these local cereal deities as Dea Sura. So Dea in Roman simply means goddess, Asura of Syria. And they ended up worshipping her alongside and in much the same way as Demeter was worshipped. Even Demeter means the mother. So this is another deity that goes back to a general motif of the goddess or the mother, somewhat related to the Earth Mother, but more domesticated type of Earth Mother, more Neolithic, more farming and civilized. And that's why I portray Syria here on a throne, because a lot of the portrayals of this agricultural queen goddess are seated with animals around holding various grains and cereals as a sign of wealth and prosperity. The agricultural revolution, the Neolithic, was essentially a golden age where there was plenty. They were first kind of forced into that choice of agriculture out of desperation because there was famine and drought, but it forced them to go away from more hunter-gathering and shepherdry to settle down and start trying out and experimenting with different kinds of cereals and producing that into edible foods to distribute to people. And that ended up, spreading and becoming a radical cause for population and the origin of civilization. We have Kubaba, which Kupapa, the version of Hittite that I referenced in the last video as well, is this queen, or at least represents a priesthood of this cereal production practice, this agricultural and civilizing, who mythologically ruled Sumer for hundreds of years, and she was later deified as a, agricultural deity. Of course, she didn't probably actually rule for hundreds of years because that's physiologically impossible. I just mean to say that she might have had such an impact, or her priesthood might have been so embedded in Sumer at the time that her cult would spread to other places, say to the Hittites with their version of Kupapa, and then further on to the Phrygians who came into Anatolia where the Hittites were, and getting Kupapa as a deity eventually evolved it into Kybele, which they were merging with Zimele, who was a Thracian deity related to Dagon, which I mentioned earlier, the earth goddess deity, and there was a merger going on with the two that kind of make Kybele, who is this agricultural seated deity. And a weird coincidence across the sea with the Taino of the Caribbean is their own agricultural goddess, in that case having more to do with maize and potatoes, was Kahubaba. I'm not saying there's some sort of supernatural link between these two deities or something, you know. I'm sure all the ancient aliens people would say, oh my god, Kubaba must have been an alien who went around instructing people to do agriculture, and she went to the Taino and told them, and they went to the Sumerians and told them, right? But this is a case I think might be coincidence or might even be due to some sort of translation going on with the Spanish influence. Then you have the Totonac, who are another people from Mesoamerica, representing for them not grains, not cereals explicitly, but another form of grass, which is maize. And with her and with many other deities here I'm going to mention, there is the motif of the corn mother in Amerindian mythology. Onatha of the Iroquois is actually become popular in a lot of neo-pagan American movements that try to integrate Western paganism with more local First National paganism. And I think that's a very noble attempt to do it. Onatha is quite well worshipped in that sense. I mean, America has become a bread basket for corn in many ways, so it's fitting that that would be a motif that Americans ought to, recognize and respect and pay homage to. You got Chicomecoatl of the Aztecs, also a corn mother. Utzet of the Zia, that's a Pueblo people. The Pueblo people, by the way, Pueblo is just a term by the Spanish to refer to the kind of dwellings that Pueblo Indians lived in the Southwest, but Zia are like one group that is part of a different language family from, say, the Hopi or the Dena, the Navajo, for instance. They're all kind of forced into one category, but they all have a fairly different history and different times that they came into that area to settle. And there was a time when they coexisted, all having their own kind of forms of civilization. But nonetheless, they all relate to this corn mother that probably spread similar to the Western Neolithic, how it spread grain from a common source somewhere in the Levant. In this case, somewhere in Mesoamerica, where maize was first cultivated, is where this deity and this culture and some of these languages and practices probably spread out northward to the southwest and through Texas all the way to the Mississippi River Valley. That's how it eventually goes up to the Ohio River Valley, getting to the Iroquois and becoming Onatha, and then spreading down into eventually the Taino, who the Taino then they actually went through northern South America and then through Trinidad, Tobago, and the Antillean Islands all the way into Puerto Rico and Hispaniola and Cuba. And then, of course, the Incas on the other side near the Andes, they also practice some maize cultivation. And I didn't mention a few rice deities in terms of the Eastern Neolithic of rice cultivation out of somewhere around Southeast Asia where rice spread. No matter where you are in the world or what culture you come from, there are certain cultivated crops that have a thematic resonance with one another. This idea of coming together, organizing society around a common food source, a staple crop, is, I think, the essential theme of Saria. And Saria represents more than just the food and the harvest itself. Really, the word for it is community. And there was a time where this community in the Golden Age may have been very utopic and idyllic and well organized. And later, hierarchies and all these other things started getting involved. So I think this is a place where we can all, from all around the world, relate to our roots and try to build a society that works for everybody and that has sustainable and real foundations, food, basic needs and necessities, right? I actually tried multiple times to generate a sickle for her to hold. I wanted to go really hardcore on the whole communist angle, but for some reason it was very difficult. It just did not want to generate a sickle in the right way. But just understand, communism is subliminal in this message I'm sending to you. This is definitely propaganda. At last, I want to mention a goddess who was immortalized in the Virgo constellation. Holding a bushel of wheat, the Coma Berenices constellation in one hand and the scales Libra in the other. Her name is Astrea. She manifested during the Golden Age and Bronze Age, a reflection of order, prosperity, purity, and utopia. But at the dawn of the Iron Age, during the Bronze Age collapse, she was said to have chastised humanity for our failure to live up to her noble standards, leaving the earth for the heavens, where she would become the Virgo constellation. It is also said that one day she will return to bring about a new golden age for all of humanity. The rediscovery of this prophecy in the 1500s even helped inspire many writers and artists of the Renaissance. One might see her today in Lady Liberty, perhaps, but I think we still have much more work to do in order to live up to her standards for us. Don't you? Now we have Libra. And the name Aurora I took directly from the Roman goddess of dawn and beauty, like in the imagery provided. The beautiful, colorful aurora of light that's shining before the sun rises over the horizon. And dawn is associated with the dawn star or the morning star, which is Venus. And Venus is both the morning star and the evening star. Because it's closer to the sun than the earth, we see it whenever the sun comes up over the horizon, or when the sun goes over the other side of the horizon. We can see Venus following closely behind. Mercury also follows the sun around because they're both inner planets. And this Venus connotation, apart from so much of the other motifs here, is what connects it so profoundly to Libra as an astrology sign. Since dawn literally represents the beginning of the new day, it metaphorically represents new life and birth and youth. And this sharply contrasts with the ideas about the evening star, which I am not showing in this presentation, but there is a goddess of the evening star I call Victoria, which has to do with death and the afterlife and the West. Here's another thing about dawn. It is associated with the east because that's where the sun comes up over the horizon. And so a lot of these names like Eos, Husos, Ostara, and Easter all relate to the east. So Eos is the Greek goddess of dawn. Ushas is the Vedic Hindu. Dawn, where we get the word dawn, comes from a Welsh and Gallic source, so a Celtic source. Husos is the Proto-Indo-European goddess of dawn, reconstructed based on all these other names like Eos and Ostara and such. Another name for Ostara is Eostra or Easter, which is where we get the holiday from. And the holiday of Easter, of course, is not within the time frame of Libra in October. It's quite the opposite. It's in the spring, whereas October is in the fall. But because of dawn and the idea of new life, that is why Easter is associated with spring, because it's when new life is coming back from the death of winter. In my episode of Aries, the shepherd god, I neglected to mention Pales, a shepherd god similar to Adonis in the Roman pantheon. His festival, Perilia, is a possible namesake of April, but so too is the Etruscan goddess Apru, same as Greek Aphrodite, equated with Venus, the Roman goddess. As per my last email, Adonis and Aphrodite were lovers, and I equated Adonis with Aries, aka Mars, the patron god of the Romans. Rome was founded in April, the month of Aries, and Veneralia, the festival of Venus, was celebrated on April 1st. Easter is often celebrated in late March on the cusp of Pisces and Aries. Aphrodite is also referred to as one of the two fish of the Pisces constellation, despite the fact that Pisces is associated with Neptune rather than Venus, at least these days. Tangled webs like these are part of the reason I felt the need to make this deck. Let me simplify it for you. In our Pandemonic pantheon, Aurora is the dawn goddess of Venus. One of her lovers is Lazarus, shepherd god of Mars, and she is to be considered separate from Sheila, the sea goddess of Neptune. She is also distinct from the birth goddess Leuthia, who is associated with the cusp sign Cetus between Pisces and Aries. Late March These three personas, however, share a certain set of mysterious commonalities, which, along with many others in the pantheon, we will have to work out as we go. For instance, there are many triple deities, trimurtis, and trinities throughout various mythologies and pagan movements. Hecate, who has evolved into the triple goddess of Wicca, might be represented by three goddesses: the maiden, the mother, and the crone. The dawn, the day, and the dusk, etc. Anyway, Aurora is associated with the new growth of spring through her relationship with Lazarus in April. Her April form might be thought of as Meritha, based on Athena, who shares a common ancestor, historically speaking, with Aphrodite in Ishtar. Ishtar turned into Astarte of the Phoenicians and seems to have then split for the Greeks into Aphrodite in one hand and Athena on the other, one retaining all of the beauty, dawn, and Venus aspects of Ishtar, the other, Athena, retaining the more military, war, and governance aspects. Sometimes it is hard even for me to draw distinctions between deities in my own system. After all, our pantheon, as with any living pantheon, is and always will be a work in progress. Now, a few of those aspects having to do with, say, justice and power, I left for another deity in Libra here, since there are three. Her name is Sophia. Aurora is the more elder, kind of astronomical, celestial goddess, nature goddess. Sophia has a more grounded, kind of political persona. But largely, Ishtar and such represents the selective forces of femininity. Ea is more like this more abstract version in Akkadian and Mesopotamian, since she represents literally the dawn, although she also has some justice motifs with her as well, which again brings together this whole Libra motif, since Libra is the scales and related directly with justice and many justice deities. Freya of Norse relates to this Ea sort of atmospheric dawn goddess motif, and Freya is a goddess also of beauty and selection. She rides her chariot pulled by cats, right? Leading the sun, leading the new day forward. To broaden this motif a little bit more to some other regions in the world, Asit is a Yakutian, and that would be a Siberian goddess of dawn, who is given the specific role associated with the East of guiding new souls, or perhaps reincarnated souls, into their new bodies when they're born every day. So this feeds into a universal myth theme of the dawn representing birth and the dusk representing death, the East representing beginning, and the West representing the end. With that particular Siberian deity adds another dimension of this, having to do with birth in a very literal sense. Similar sounding deity to both Ea and this Asit would be the Armenian dawn goddess. An egg also sometimes is conflated with angel, with the Christianization of Armenia. There's another angel deity, Angelia, that is related to Armenian as well, and the idea of angel, which is slightly more chthonic, but this one would be a quintessential angel. I actually integrated the imagery of a seraphim angel with 6 wings, because I think the idea of an angel in this astral, celestial, new beginning, good sense is quite compatible with a lot of that sort of angelic imagery. Fallen angel on the other side of that has more to do with, I guess, the Victoria in the evening. Of course, in a Christian and even Zoroastrian type of worldview, there's good angels and there's evil angels. And I don't subscribe to that sort of black and white moralism. There is a place for those evening motifs as well, I think, in our pantheon that doesn't simply treat them as evil or fallen in a sense. There's also Yahubaba of the Taino, again, the Caribbean, Amerindian culture, who as a goddess also represents the gathering aspect of hunter-gathering and song, and is associated with the songbird of the nightingale. Even from the Western perspective of calling it a nightingale, this songbird is associated with the new morning, the calling, the singing, the song of the new morning, but also with the dusk and with the night, the coming of the night. There's many of these crow or corvid-like deities, crows and ravens, for instance, that represent the dusk. The cusp sign in our system of Corvus represents the archetype. So there's a dynamic between Libra here of the dawn and then its cusp in Corvus toward Virgo of the dusk. And that is the sign of Victoria that I keep referring to. And then we have Jaska of the Incan, maiden of beauty and dawn, and the morning star Venus. I feel the need to say now, I don't know if I mentioned it quite enough earlier on, but this is obviously not an exhaustive list here that I'm putting in this presentation. I'm cherry picking fairly random examples, and I know that I'm under speaking about various cultures when going through these slides, but I'm focusing on the strongest motifs I can find. There are 72 cards, so there are 72 different deities where there's at least this many strong references that I can refer to. These are just some examples. There are many other dawn goddesses and many other mythologies, and I'm constantly also working on my database and improving it, and frankly, I need help with that. Next, we have Scorpio. Nexus is, in many ways, a lot like Gaia, in that she seems to be one of the most widespread, oldest motifs. Arguably, even in the Greek records for the lineage of gods and goddesses, Nyx, the goddess of night, is one of, if not the oldest deity in all of Greek mythology. Older even than Gaia. Another reason that I can call myself both a secular atheist and also a practicing pagan is because I can recognize that the original concept of Nyx to the Greeks is a concept that is widely accepted today, and that is oblivion. Every culture that had a night goddess that was the first mother of all the gods is essentially indicating that there was a void, that there was an abyss. The only deity that could really be said to have possibly been older, or at least the same age as Nyx in the Greek pantheon, would be Chaos, the namesake of chaos, which is the very idea of the abyss and the nothingness and the void before existence. Pandemonium, right? Like in the branding here. So Chaos was the masculine aspect of this. The feminine aspect of this is Nyx, in this case Nexus. Now there are two Egyptian deities that I'm citing here as prime examples and inspirations for Nexus of the Pandemonic pantheon. Nephthys is a night mother goddess of darkness and also of death and the underworld, and is also a source of healing and of life for the Egyptian pantheon, for many other Egyptian deities. There's a pretty obscure Sumerian deity called Baba. As we've heard a few different times, like Kubaba of the Sumerians, Baba essentially means mother. Since there are other Babas, simply Baba implies that this deity was extremely important and fundamental to the Sumerians, that she was the mother goddess. And this is compatible with so many other cultures. What we do know about her is that she's represents life and birth and creation, and is often besieged for health concerns. It's like if you need some help, you go to your mother. You know, you go to Baba. Baba, very specifically in the symbology of Sumer, is associated with Scorpio, and therefore with the constellation Scorpio. And then in the same pantheon of Egypt, we have Neith, who is an Egyptian and also Berber goddess of the night and of the fearful uncertainty of night and fate, which is a key concept here. And she's also associated with water and with rivers and with the source of those rivers in reservoirs. And also, along with that, birth and creation. She is synonymous with the dark abyss. And this is where we get an interesting compounding that helped me to make the choice in my pantheon to conflate the night goddess with the abyssal goddess. And by abyssal, I guess I mean reservoir, the water reservoir of the underworld, a chthonic element. It is possible to look at night goddess as purely celestial or astral or sky goddess without having any sort of abyssal chthonic connotation. But what I found in a lot of this research, like especially with the example of Neith here, is there's a connection between the dark abyss of space, the void that we're talking about, and the dark abyss of the underworld, of the reservoirs, the deep reservoirs. They're both mysterious, especially when looking at this from an astrological lens of coding the scorpionic aspects as a water sign and as a chthonic sign represent the darker aspects of the natural and the human world. Of all the water signs that could be associated with the underworld, it would be Scorpio. So we have one aspect of this scorpionic elder deity having to do with the night. It relates to goddesses like Nisha in Vedic, who's essentially a very similar Nyx-like deity, possibly stemming from Indo-European, or probably an older source, since this deity is quite consistent throughout global cultures. Some of these names and some of these ideas go back way further than that influence. There's also Nashi Adza in the Dene or Navajo mythology, which is this crazy coincidence when you see, again, these Amerindians having a name very similar to Nisha and Neith and all of these night deities. Nashi Adza is a night goddess that is often called in various Amerindian pantheons the spider grandmother. And she's associated with dreams and with weaving. In her case, the weaving of the very fabric of the universe, the weaving of the stars and the planets. So she's essentially a creatrix, again implying her being very fundamental. This connection between the night and the stars and weaving and spiders and creation is extremely profound and widespread throughout the world. It's kind of similar to Arianrod of Welsh, who's associated with the moon, but, in that sense with stars, with weaving, and the thread wheel. And there's Ihema of Estonian. Estonian is a branch of Finnic or Finno-Ugric languages. She was a goddess of twilight and the night, and weaves, and again souls in the underworld, and is connected with spiders. So this brings the spider grandmother of the Dene and the southwestern Pueblo in here. There's also a Aztec spider grandmother. And also Teotihuacan, the mysterious city, one of the first major cities in Mesoamerica, had as seemingly their primary deity a spider grandmother figure. We don't know the name of her, but she seems to have been the namesake or the real patron of that particular city too. And then there's many more spider type deities that I could mention, but one I will mention here is Mitandi of the Nyango Bantu people of Africa. She's a moon goddess that represents the moon phases and the changeability. With the scorpionic category I have here of 3 deities, there's 2 goddesses. One is Nexus and one is Arachnia. A lot of the spidery and weaving connotations are more associated with her. And so it's been a little difficult in my research to try to find a way of splitting the two, because you really almost can't split the two. We also have Ayakashi Kone, who is a Japanese goddess of the night, darkness, magic, and the Milky Way. Again, an astral, stellar sort of connection. We come to the Maori of New Zealand, a Polynesian people, and their goddess Nui Tepo. Also, in line with this kind of Nui linguistics, is a goddess of night. She holds the spirits and souls within the underworld. And that's where we're getting to another set of Greek deities that I took a lot of inspiration from. There's Tethys, which was an ancient Greek Titan goddess of essentially reservoirs or underground water sources, fresh water. And she was partners with Oceanos, who was salt water. And that's similar to a dynamic in Sumerian between Tiamat, who's a female saltwater goddess, and then Abzu, which was the male freshwater deity, and those still have a place in the pantheon elsewhere. Styx is another entity that is not always personified as a deity, but the river Styx is, of course, the river of the underworld. I would call it the nexus of the underworld, the nexus of all the rivers. Essentially, it represents, like Tethys, the nexus of where all the rivers of the world come together and flow into the underworld. When we die, wherever we are, we flow to the same place. And since the souls are flowing through the river Styx, it's very similar to, say, in the Hercules Disney movie. There's Apia, who's a Scythian chthonic earth mother, similarly referenced in this very fundamental and mother of mothers kind of way. She's associated also with water. And the Scythians were like a key Indo-European people, like one of the most fundamental Indo-European people. And Apia kind of relates to the abyss. I mentioned Absu as the male chthonic water deity of the Sumerians and of Babylonians. And in the Bible, in the Torah, the idea of the abyss before existence is kind of a tell for the original deity, the original energy of the world, which was this night goddess, this night god or goddess, this abyssal entity, chaos and Nyx. There's Akana of the Turkic pantheon, who is also a mother goddess of creation and water and souls and spirits of the dark abyss, the underworld, very similar to Amma and Apia that we've mentioned. Moving on, there's the Buryat, who are a Mongolic Altaic people, whose goddess Amma is a dark chthonic goddess of the underworld. And the underworld, to their perception, resides under Lake Baikal, which is, native to that northern Mongolian and Siberian Altaic mountain region. It's really fun to have a specific location like Lake Baikal. It's like, there's the underworld. In Romanian Christian folklore, there is the concept of Appa Sembeti, which is essentially Sembeti has to do with the Sabbath. It's Saturday, and Appa means the water or the holy water. And holy water, in this sense, to them was conflated with the idea of the fundamental water of existence, the abyssal ocean, right? And so, in that sense, the Styx, the Tethys, this divine creative water is the holy water. Romanian Christianity actually synthesized a lot of elements from prior Dacian mythology. And this term in Romanian refers also to outer space. That's essentially their apologetic understanding of how the universe came to be in a very big bangy way. And so they actually kept the idea that souls would go to this place, this nexus under the earth eventually when they die. Souls of the dead would flow on the course of all the rivers into this abyssal space ocean. And I think that's mostly in the context of people who were going to hell. So their rationalization for Christianity is essentially that those who are Christian, they go to heaven, they go and escape the world, whereas those who die and go to hell, they are essentially flushed down into this nexus. And as they get closer and closer to hell, I think they circle hell through 3 times before falling in, and the water at hell is boiling. There's an old folk kind of myth that you want to be careful in Romania when you're drinking out of a river, because you might drink the soul of a person and become possessed. It's really interesting. And while we're on the topic of Christianity, I'd like to mention 3 different instances of kind of Judeo-Christian angels or demons. Layla in many of the Abrahamic faiths is an angel of the night who influences your dreams and tries to seduce you with desire and mystical beliefs. So there's a sort of fear-mongering about Layla, that she's trying to corrupt you into a more mystical understanding of things, or to be in touch with your subconscious. There's many aspects of Abrahamic faiths which are highly repressive, and they only accept a few motifs from a few deities, if even a few and not just one, and every other aspect of life, every other aspect of humanity has to be repressed. So sex or mysticism or deep connection to a divine archetype, these things are considered sinful and evil and corrupt when they actually are not. I like to think that this is Nexus trying to wake people up from their ideological slumber during the day. And now I'd like to talk about a slightly different Judeo-Christian sort of tradition, which is Mandaism. And Mandaism is a kind of esoteric Gnostic sect which integrated different Greek, Iranian, and Jewish beliefs all into an interesting mix. Their cultural background is largely Aramaean. Now, Aramaic is a Semitic language that became the main Semitic language throughout much of the Middle Ages, and that's the period in which Mandaism kind of spread. They actually believed that John the Baptist was the final prophet of the Abrahamic faiths. And so in some ways they kind of represent the messianic movement that Jesus himself was a part of or influenced by. There's a goddess in this pantheon, and the line between angel and deity in Mandaism is quite blurred, so I simply can call them angel or god. She was the goddess of darkness and the abyss. In particular, the polluted, watery abyss of the underworld. There's this, again, kind of Abrahamic purity taboo, where the idea that the underworld is filled with souls is a polluting and disgusting idea. Zoroastrianism, like Mandaism and many other dualisms or dualistic types of religions or philosophies, tend to be quite ascetic. And ascetic means essentially prioritizing an idea or a morality over reality, over your body, over the material world. Often these philosophies demonize the material world and believe that it's essentially a big deception by Satan or by another malevolent force to try to trick them into losing faith in the mere ideas and ideologies that they're holding on to. And that's a very risky thing. Dualism is the opposite of integral. It is purely antithetical. It allows no opening for synthesis, no opening for coming together and integrating different worldviews and seeing something from another perspective and actually understanding that rather than saying that's that perspective and that's the opposite of mine, essentially straw manning another position, right? There's an ascetic undertone that when you die and go into the underworld, into the nexus, that you're going deeper into the earth, into the material world, rather than escaping it entirely into the heavens and just, wisping away. The opposition here, astrologically speaking, is essentially between a grounded, organic scorpionic energy, it's chthonic and dark, and a high, lofty, and abstract perspective in, say, an Aquarian. These two energies don't always jive very well, the Aquarian and the Scorpionic, the chthonic and the astral. There is a will for a lot of these ascetic idealisms to escape the material world and to the celestial void, essentially. Now, a lot of them put forth the idea that the celestial void is not a void but a paradise and this and that. But it's odd because that's really a projection of the material world, material success, material prosperity onto an imaginary afterlife that is placed in the void but has none of the properties of the void. The reality might be something more like that this is the reality we live in, and this defines success, and all the value we're going to get is here in this life. And if you want to escape this life into the void, into some other world that you believe exists, you'll end up nowhere at all. There is nowhere else to go. This is it. So another Mandaic deity I wanted to mention is Ruha or Nimrus, Hiwat, Amamit, Dayum. There's all these different names for her. And she's another underworld dark goddess that literally refers to the stars. Again, like Layla, to desire and the seductive elements, but is also the creator of the zodiac and the seven celestials, and that would be the seven planets. She is credited as seducing these faithful people to astrology, mysticism, and the occult. It's very interesting, and I think as a pagan and an astrologer, it can be fun to take that back and be like, oh, that sounds cool. She sounds great. I'm going to add her to my pantheon. And so that's, to an extent, something that Nexus really can and should represent. We have Sagittarius, possibly the most popular deity on Earth, apart from Sky Father and Earth Mother. How often he is the king, how often he is the primary hero and the archetype of the hero. We talked about how Lazarus is a sort of hero in that Hector protector kind of way. Thandros is the kind of hero who goes on adventures, who makes great conquests. Although not explicitly a war god in all times, the focus, like with Sagittarius, is more on adventure and exploration. He's based on the thunder gods from various pantheons, like Thunor, most significantly, of Anglian, so that's Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo part. That is Thor from Norse. It's basically the same between Germanic and Norse. Thor is something of this adventurous hero, right? He isn't explicitly king, because Odin in the Norse pantheon is king, but Thor is the most powerful, most popular son of the king. And even in heathenism today, he is one of the most popular deities, of course, to worship. And Mjolnir is one of the most popular symbols used for heathenism. Then there's Tarhana, which I mentioned in the Hittite video that I did last. His name also related to thunder. Tarhana is a little bit more like Zeus as a king of the gods. And that's similar to Jove, or Jupiter of the Romans, the namesake of the planet Jupiter, and Perkrunos, who's the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European thunder god who splits off into various different thunder gods. Perun is one such very closely related Slavic version of Perkrunos. The Slavic and Baltic cultures are some of the most closely linguistically related to the Proto-Indo-European. Similar, there's also like Perendi for the Illyrians and such. The Indo-European thunder god is very important, and for them was the king of the pantheon. And in many different mythologies, like say in Greek, you have Zeus usurping his father Kronos, who was the previous king of Olympus. And what that represents when you find a passing from one generation to another of deities, from the Titans to the Olympians, it means or indicates that there was a cultural shift, or that maybe an invading people, in this case the Indo-Europeans, came in and supplanted and usurped the previous mythology, but kind of integrated it into a story. A story that, in this case, as with many cases with the thunder god, the phrase, history is written by the victors, applies here. Zeus usurps Kronos, Jupiter usurps Saturnus, Tarhana comes in and usurps Kumarbi, Marduk of Babylon, their thunder god, essentially usurps El. There's a kind of rewriting of history. Originally, with the origin story of the Sumerians, it's Enlil, the mountain god, more akin to Kumarbi and Kronos, who is the king of the gods. And he is the one who defeats Tiamat, the chaotic, draconic sea goddess, in order to establish order over the world. The Sumerians are not considered a Semitic culture. Their language, at least, was of some different make. But when the Semites came in with the Akkadians and then the Amorites, who became Babylonians, they rewrote the story and had a new character, Marduk, who is their kind of war and thunder god. And in that very same story, in this rewrite through the Enuma Elish, it is Marduk who defeats Tiamat. It's somewhat related to the Martu deity that I referred to earlier in reference to Lazarus again. Martu has more of ram and war connotations, and so I placed him within Aries and Lazarus, but there are aspects of him, as I mentioned with Baal Hamon much later, that are conflated with a Zeus-like storm thunder god, in which case there's a coupling of these war and thunder motifs into a single entity. Other versions of him directly in Syria and with the Phoenicians would be Hadad and Baal, like I mentioned. Baal, of course, relates again to that Carthaginian Punic deity of Baal Hamon, and Hadad actually relates a little bit to that Hamon Amun sort of language as well. Enlil himself, just like Kronos himself, usurped a deity from before him, and that would indicate that this deity that they usurped was very old, even older than the Sumerians, even older than Neolithic Bronze Age Greeks, which we call Helladic peoples. That would be Oranos, or Anu, Skyfather, which again we've established is one of the oldest and most widespread deities in history. There was Skyfather, and then there was a mountain king who led the Golden Age defined by the Neolithic, by farming and agriculture. And then we have a youthful, adventurous, warlike storm god come on and become king. If I can simplify it, make it very bare bones, you could say that the Stone Age god was Ornos, the Skyfather, that the Neolithic god was the settled agricultural king like Kronos, and that the Iron Age Indo-European god was like Zeus. Indra is another deity, this of the Vedic Hindu pantheon. The Vajra that is portrayed here with the card is based on Indra's Vajra, which is a symbol of power and essentially represents the thunderbolts that he's holding. Sometimes, say in Africa, they're called thunderstones, and the idea of a thunderstone is that when lightning strikes, it's almost like a meteor. There's a rock that's being thrown. If you see lightning strike, you can go out there and find a rock, the thunderstone of that lightning strike. The Vedic period that I'm referring to here is, again, an Indo-European, the Aryan period in India, which is after the original Indus River Valley civilization, which was more Neolithic and had Middle Eastern roots. Dravidian language, for instance, is found to be potentially related to the Susian or Elamite language, which was a language group and culture that was right next to the Sumerians, more toward Iran. And so this all proves a link between the Indus Valley and the Middle East, that there was some linguistic and cultural exchange between them. In the Hindu pantheon today, we have largely two deities that are some of the most important, the two main sects of Hinduism, even though there are many other sects and subsects. Shaivism, which is around Shiva, and then there's Vaishnavism, which is around Vishnu. And Shiva and Vishnu are somewhat opposites in certain ways, but they're not vilifying each other. They have different motifs and different worldviews, I suppose. And really, it just means there's two separate deities there that are highly important. Often they are conflated with other deities within their respective pantheons. One such sect, other than those two, would be Shaktiism. And Shaktiism is named after Shakti, who's essentially the goddess of life and energy and vitality, the feminine force of the universe of creation. And Shakti's partner essentially is Indra. And the two of them, ironically, the Shak sound, essentially represents the same Sagittarian energy. And Shaktiism actually spread largely into Indonesia and Java and Bali and such, which is why they have certain translations of Shaktic deities like Indra, Intra, and Indanda and such in the Southeast Asia. Shaivism with Shiva probably goes back to the Neolithic in some relationship to the same Enlil, El, Kronos, Kumarbi type, who represents power and associated with mountains and with discipline. In Shaivism, we essentially have a version of Kronos that is not vilified, that isn't treated as this old, corrupt, tyrannical ruler, but actually as an embodiment of extreme discipline and power and healthy, masculine, protective energy. Vaishnavism, I won't get too much else into, but is largely most related to the Apollonian tradition in Greek, so around Apollo, the sun god, and also potentially around motifs of Ra, the Egyptian sun god. So Essentially, you have a Capricorn-esque Saturnian Shiva tradition. You have a Leo solar Vishnu tradition. And then you have a energetic thunder storm god Shakti Indra Sagittarian tradition. We've got Tishtar of Zoroastrian, another essential translation of this thunder god type Indo-European deity. There are interesting little linguistic coincidences, like with the Enloi of the Vietnamese being another thunder god. Is Zeus, for instance, comes from the same basis as Skyfather does in Proto-Indo-European, which would be Dios, Deus, which means day. And so the word day really refers to the sky. Zeus being a thunder god, there's three types of main sky fathers. There's the Sagittarian type, which is storm. There's the Leo type, which is the sun. Then there is Aquarian type, which is the blue sky itself. Those are the three most popular sky fathers. Usually when I refer to sky father, a few slides from now, I'm referring to Aquarius or to Aether. And this is where I want to make another point, that just because the Indo-Europeans had a prominent thunder deity doesn't mean that they had the first and only thunder deity. They probably inherited their thunder deity from previous thunder gods. For instance, I actually forgot to list it here, but I just added to the bottom of the list, Ukko and Orko. They are both the thunder god of their respective pantheons in Finnish and Basque. This connection here is one way in which I'm wondering how much Western hunter-gatherer influence is at the core of this kind of thunder god. Since the Basque live in northern Spain, and they have lived there before almost any other recorded group, Finno-Ugric languages up in Finland have potentially a mix of Eastern and Western hunter-gatherers. Many of these old hunter-gatherer caribou hunters would follow the tundra all the way up into places like south of Finland and Russia and such. This thunder deity might have actually been common to both people. And that's why we see this relationship here. Orko might actually also relate to an old Greek and Roman deity of Orcus, or Horkos, who's a chthonic god of oaths and the underworld. And also ultimately might relate to the word orc, which comes from ogre, which was a Caucasian name for a sort of giant, very much the same as a Titan or a Jotun. Nonetheless, here with these two, we can see something of a connection, as not simply a hero all the time, but as having a dark side as well. I think every deity here should have a light and a dark side. Not necessarily a more dualistic view, but a integral view. Gods should be just as complex as people are, I think, which is quite contrarian to any sort of monotheistic or monistic view of God, that God should be completely separate and different from humans. To me, that would be a worldview that is very anti-human. And then there's Li Shen of Chinese and Raijin of Japanese. And Raijin is similar to the Ukko Orko, quite chaotic. He's not overtly evil, but he does create chaos. There's great artistry in his depiction of these drums that he beats to make the thunder, and the bags of wind that he carries, and I really like that portrayal. We also have Tahaki, the Maori, Polynesian mythology, who are quite benevolent and heroic in their deeds. And then to the other side of the world, we find deities like Tlaloc, Chak, and Ilapa of Amerindian pantheons. They are also seen as largely benevolent and largely as rulers in their pantheons, but they definitely have dark sides. And we also have Thobad Zishini, who's a Dene or Navajo deity as well, but he too is a thunder god. A lot of the thunder gods in Amerindian myth, a hero often coupled with a twin, the other twin being more magical. One of the twins, the thunder twin, having thunderbolts that he's given by his father, or again, Thunderbird, a spiritual entity that he interfaces with, in order to defeat great beasts and monsters, protect his people. And a lot of these stories kind of stem from really the history of the Amerindians traveling so far across Siberia and into Alaska and into the Americas, a few of their stories are about travel in this sense of like taking their people through the wilderness and smiting great beasts. And some of these beasts maybe were something like mastodons or other ice age mammals and megafauna that have since gone extinct. I think giant sloths were also somewhere on eastern United States. Or perhaps they're referring to when they were back in Siberia, the Neanderthals or the Denisovans that they interfaced with, or maybe they're just referring to animals in general, or maybe it's purely made up, very similar to Titans and ogres that I mentioned earlier. It could be any one of those things. Again, implying that this thunder god has some relationship to usurping a generation of giants. There's the concept of Wakinyan in Sioux mythology as well, are not so much gods or a god, but they're spirits of the West that come and select worthy heroes, essentially, from among the people. And the name means sacred wings, so they're essentially the thunderbird. And these thunderbirds show themselves to worthy people, and they become kind of divinely possessed, let's say, almost like demigods. This is kind of similar to the motif in a lot of the Assassin's Creed games of the eagle or the hawk, or this bird spirit that is watching over the main character, the Gary Stew. He's the chosen one, right? Now, this hero to the Sioux is actually called the Heoka. He is a sacred clown in the sense. There's something of a almost Woden-like madness, almost Dionysian in the way they embrace life and represent and manifest and channel these archetypal forces. They come to rebel when rebellion is necessary. They come to criticize when criticism is needed. They come to dance and, in a very therapeutic way, express what is not being expressed by the people or the culture at that time. So that is something of a true hero. They're often depicted later once horses become common to the Sioux tribes on horseback. And that hero archetype, for me, fits within the other deity card that I have in this set of Sagittarius, and he's called Tyrannos. That's meant not in a tyrannical way, although maybe it is, because a tyrant is not necessarily a bad thing. Meant to be a hero who rises up to lead when it is absolutely necessary, when the previous system is in tatters and a failure. And Tyrannos is depicted on horseback, and he's the hero, he's the conqueror, he's the liberator. And that's the more personified humanistic version of this Sagittarian thunder god archetype. For Thandros here, I basically represent him as that thunderbird, that spirit which blesses the hero and sides with him and watches over him in his ambition. And that's very similar to how Zeus and a lot of these other thunder gods and other pantheons are treated in heroic and demigod type myths. He's watching over and rooting for the hero and is the deus ex machina in many scenes. He comes in and he interferes to make things go that hero's way. And that's really why this relates to the hero's journey, the monomyth, a lot. In today's cinema, we criticize this story as being samey and frankly unrelatable because these people almost always succeed and often they seem to be just handed success. And a lot of coincidences occur, and that's a byproduct of bad writing for sure. But what I think could be interesting is that essentially the writers of those stories, in all their bad writing and all of their contrivances and all of their forced deus ex machinas and stuff, they are basically being Zeus. They're being the thunderbird in that situation, and they're pulling strings to make their hero heroic, you know. And I think it would be more interesting to have more stories that actually embody those types of forces, almost at least in a humorous way. In the myths of Hercules, I mentioned in the Greek video, there are many times that he is bailed out by Zeus or by some other god or goddess, and in many of the myths, the gods and goddesses take sides and help or hinder any particular hero along their journey. It's not as simple as some contrivance to get the hero to go ahead. It's a conversation about different motifs and different archetypes and how they do and don't align. That's interesting, and the different stories of how all the different gods would compete and bicker with one another over what they think is right is actually quite interesting and fun to read. We need some more literature like that. Next of Capricorn coming in here, Kronos. In Kronos, the name is taken straight from Kronos, the Greek god, with a K being the king of the gods and representing agriculture in the Neolithic and having a scythe and all these different symbologies. Kronos in the CH spelling is actually from the Orphic tradition, which is somewhat loaned from the Thracians and Dacians and Phrygians. Orpheus being considered a Phrygian, and the Orphic tradition considered to be Orpheus's poetry about the gods, which saw Kronos as a god of time, as one of the first gods in existence, arriving alongside essentially Nyx and Chaos and these other entities that I talked about that are very primordial and existential and celestial. So Kronos is an important idea to the mystical traditions, really. The scythe that represents death in the Grim Reaper way. As time is encroaching upon you, death is encroaching upon you. There's an association there, but ultimately with the harvest and with the agriculture, again, that connection to Kronos as an agricultural deity, but more abstracted into the element of time. And of course, I have a watch here to show the time. As Saturnus, he's associated with satyrs and with these half-man, half-goat, sort of wild, somewhat chaotic and divine and mad, but wise beings. Part of the Orphic tradition and part of the Thracian influence in Greece is Dionysus and the Dionysian cults, which again have this idea of madness and inspiration and mad wisdom, essentially. I've mentioned already Enlil, El, Kumarbi, even Shiva, and all of these deities have some aspect of a primordial mountain god, grandfather of time and of creation and destruction. And that, in the most abstract sense, is what Kronos represents. There's another deity in this pantheon, Sivanos or Koronos, who is the younger version of this in Capricorn, who has more of the young, adventurous, agricultural king that Shiva and, say, Enlil, El, Kumarbi might possibly have represented. So the two are very similar and very linked. I tend to think of the dynamic between the elder god in a sign and the younger god in the sign as almost a manifestation or a avatar of them. I considered even for the cards of each elder god, like say Kronos here, not even to have a statue, not even to be personified at all. I considered it just to be maybe a shrine or just an environment like the mountaintops here. But ultimately, I enjoyed generating the art for these statues and every little detail in their portrayal. There's certainly too many of them that I liked and enjoyed working with to disembody, but nonetheless, they are probably better said disembodied, better understood as disembodied and having many manifestations. Ultimately, all these deities do, I guess, but let's not get iconoclastic. We're also manifesting these ideas in a way that people can connect with and that can harness much more symbology and meaning than just an idea on its own, just a word. Now, there are other very profound grandfather gods through many pantheons. There is Dagda in the Irish, and there's Daksha in Vedic, and there's Dagon in Syrian, or I think it's from Mari, the city-state in Euphrates. You can maybe call him Euphratian, I guess. And the Hebrew tradition, I think, has Dag, grandfather, king of wealth and power and majesty, the great king, the great-grandfather of all kings and all dynasties. Huang Di in Chinese that I don't have in here is also similar to that because he's the founding dynast, the founding monarch of all the Chinese emperors. He's the first emperor. He's the golden yellow emperor. I don't necessarily place every deity purely within a single category. I often have a more nuanced way of looking at it. In my database that I work with using Obsidian, it's possible to hashtag various codes and signs into any particular entry I have. Now, Dagda is the grandfather of the Irish and the Tuatha De Danann, and he was god of skill and wisdom and experience and life and death. Very similar to that Shiva motif that I was talking about of creation and destruction. Daksha in Vedic is the grandfather, kind of founder of their gods as well. And he is portrayed as having a goat head, or at least he gets a goat head eventually. I think he has his head severed and replaced by one. Further solidifying this Capricorn connection, as Capricorn is the sign of the goat. And Daksha, similarly, possibly related to an Indo-European or other source. The Irish Celtic and the Vedic Hindu are both related to a common Indo-European ancestor. This name for a common ancient grandfather might have been consistent or possibly coincidental, because very likely, based on what I've been telling you, this deity goes back before the Indo-European influence in both India and Ireland. It's possible. Maybe they're both referring to the same Middle Eastern source of the Neolithic, and they're simply spreading through Indo-European language this same motif that they inherited from Neolithic peoples. In the case of Scythians, their namesake is Scythes, and Scythes is their Kronos, whose namesake is the scythe. They likely inherited that from a Neolithic source, maybe even the Cucuteni-Trypillian culture, since the Scythians came to reside within the homeland. Cucuteni-Trypillian culture was a Neolithic culture that settled in Ukraine right next to the original Indo-European Yamnaya people, and they were trading with them regularly. We have Kala of Javanese, who's again a sort of conceptual deity of time, destruction, wealth, associated also with the underworld and with eclipses. And it's very possible that he might have been something of a loan from the Hindu pantheon with Shiva. The thematic counterpart to Shiva is essentially Kali, and Kali is this goddess of destruction, time, inevitability, and power itself. To the Javanese, rather than take the name Shiva, they might have applied to Shiva as a counterpart of Kali a male translation, which is Kala. So Kali and Kala in that case. But then we see in the Filipino pantheon, there's a Canlaon, who is their creator god and represents time, associated like a few different deities in the Philippines with the volcano of the same name, Canlaon. And his name also means in reference to his partner, who is Leon. I believe the king defeated a dragon on that mountain. But this is another kind of reference to, in the ancient kingdom, a righteous king. Kimun Kamui of the Ainu is also a mountain god, and so there's all these different mountain god motifs that I syncretize with this particular deity. Guinichin, who is Mapuche deity, Mapuche or native to basically Chile in South America. And there are many flood myths right around the world, many of them probably referring to different occurrences of floods, since floods were quite common throughout the world near the end of the Ice Age, because the glaciers were melting, and so the global sea level was constantly rising, and then it was locally rising in certain situations, like say with the Black Sea. The Hellespont broke open and floodwaters from the Aegean poured in. There's all these localized flood events that happened, and any amount of people could have seen that, experienced that, and recorded it, remembered it in some form. It doesn't all have to stem from a global flood, obviously, but it's not crazy, and it's certainly not controversial to say that they are referring to actual floods that they experienced to some degree. But anyway, in this particular flood myth, it's quite unique. The mountain god is the one that saves humanity by erecting the Andes Mountains for them to climb to survive the flood. You see this kind of positive mountain god motif in a few different places in America. You also see it with the Taino of the Caribbean I mentioned, with their god Yukahu, who was essentially their creator god who provided them with agriculture and potatoes and was a benevolent, protective god of the harvest, very much like Shiva and Kronos if they were to be taken in a very positive light. He even defends the island of Hispaniola up on the top of the tallest mountain there against a hurricane. This myth actually is very similar to the myth of Typhon and Zeus, which has an older version in Japan at the bottom of this list. And Japan is a Ptolemaic Greek Egyptian syncretic deity of essentially a bit of Osiris and a bit of this Kronos motif with Pan, and it's an interesting subversion of the Sagittarian thunder god deity, essentially says. Whereas in the other myth, in Typhon, all the other gods ran away and Zeus defeated the Typhon. In this particular myth of Typhon, in this myth he's called Typhoeus, Zeus and all the other gods run away. Even Zeus fails and is not the hero in this story. And it's Pan that's the only brave one to stand up. It's the Capricorn deity that becomes a goat with the bottom half of a fish, which the Romans and Etruscans call a Aegicampoi, right? A goat fish. Pan transforms into this in the Mediterranean in order to fight off Typhon. He's going to essentially transform in whatever he needs to practically transform into in order to solve the problem, which is a very Capricornian, noble thing to do. Capricorn, largely, I feel like I have to mention, is one of the most misunderstood and honestly scapegoated and hated signs in all of the zodiac. And mythologically speaking, one of the most divisive and demonized deities in the pantheon. The very name Saturn relates ultimately and evolves into Satan, which of course the Abrahamic faiths have literally demonized. But even the Greeks with Zeus demonized Kronos and this entire generation of deities. It's interesting to find this Ptolemaic myth where Japan is the secret hero. How this relates back to Gwynedd and the Yukahu deity I mentioned of Taino is similarly, it's an agricultural Neolithic style deity that defends his people from a hurricane-like force. And it's a weird coincidence here. There's another deity in this deck, Borealis, that I synthesize Typhon, Typhoeus, and Hurricane with. It's very coincidental, but not really so coincidental, that there's the Greek deity Typhon and there's the Taino deity Hurricane. These would ultimately become the two main names we use to refer to the same exact weather phenomenon. Typhoon is the name we give in East Asia to a hurricane in the Caribbean, right? And both of them stem from different sources that did not directly interact, but have come away with the same story, treating this hurricane as a wind god of chaos and destruction, a sort of dragon that is defeated by a heroic character. Akkerbelts, I also wanted to mention, is another Basque chthonic shepherd spirit, and he is also portrayed as a black goat, a satyr, again related to this Akker Agi word, which relates to goat or horns. And then the last mention, Kiniji, who's also a Yukagir, a Siberian god of time. And so we see this god of time going back and being common, this mountain god, this ancient grandfather, this protector, being such an old and obscure deity. They don't get much press, even in their own mythologies sometimes, or at least we've lost record of when maybe they did. Ultimately, this deity has a lot of depth and a great variety of expression and needs a bit more attention, like the sign of Capricorn really does in many ways. I have mentioned him a few times, and I've mentioned Skyfather a few times, so maybe we can get through this one a little quicker. Aether is the primordial god of air, and the term in Greek philosophy has come to mean a kind of fifth element that comprises all the elements and was the original kind of atom or element of existence. But the odd thing about Aether is that it really does mean air, and air is already one of the four elements. There were a bunch of pre-Socratic Greek philosophers during the Axial Age that came to different ideas, scientific ideas for the time about how the world originated. Many of them would posit one element or another of the four elements as first element. Sometimes fire was posited as the first element, and other times water. To some extent, you might argue that the atomic theory put forth by Democritus and Leucippus was actually a earth-based theory, since it comprised many solid atoms that made up the world, essentially. From a metaphorical and poetic understanding of the elements, that makes sense. Another interesting connection here mythologically is Atum, who's the Egyptian sky god and creator god who created the universe from himself. And in a sense, with atomic theory being the fundamental building blocks of the universe, Atum represents the fundamental building block of the universe. Adam, in the biblical Judaic sources, relates to this Atum Egyptian conception of first man rewriting of the first god from Egyptian sources. The Phoenicians of Ugarit also had Aether, probably indicative of a common ancestor between Greek and Phoenician, which is also the sky god, the primordial sky god. And there's also Aethon, the name of Zeus's eagle, who is this very same one that pecks out the liver of Prometheus every day up on the mountain. In Roman, this eagle is called Aeternus, both related to eternity. To me, this speaks very literally of the constellation Aquila, which is right next to Aquarius, and in many thematic ways resonates with Aquarius as a sign, being an air sign, compatible with a bird, and so on. Tengri also associated with eagles as the sky father of the Turkic and Mongolic people. There's Anu and Anus and all these other sky deities of Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Semitic sources. Iowang in Burmese culture even has that similar connotation, but also a sky god. And there's an interesting, I wouldn't say coincidence, because it's likely, again, going back to the common source of many languages in a very old sky father deity, that we get the term Dingir in Sumerian referring to the day. And I referred to Deus and Deus and such, which are in this list as well as the Proto-Indo-European sky father. But that deity probably goes back even further. We have Diwiru of the Sotho Bantu people in South Africa, who is their sky father, has that similar sort of linguistics. Tengri and Dingir and Tian in Chinese are all indications that the sky was a primordial force of importance in people's lives, and it makes sense that it would be. Ashur, who's the namesake of Assyrians. Shu, who's the Egyptian god of wind. Who, and I mentioned Atum being the first god of the Egyptians and the god of creation. When he procreates with himself, let's say, one of the deities coming out of that, apart from Tefnut, who represents rain, moisture, spit, saliva, is Shu, who represents wind, and that sound shu, shu, kind of represents that. Ashaman is another interesting example. He is the main and most important deity to the Guanche people in the Canary Islands before the Spanish colonized it. And these people actually were of Berber ancestry, and the Berbers were across much of North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and then also to Atlantis, the idea of Atlantis being this prosperous first empire, first civilization on Earth that tragically fell, associated often with the Atlas Mountains and with the Atlantic, probably stemming mythologically from some sort of North African, Berber, or Egyptian Hamitic type source. In America, we have a lot of great spirits, as essentially their version of the Sky Father. It's a little more ambiguous and up to interpretation, but Manitou is the Algian or Algonquin name, Ichi Manitou. He's their essential Sky Father and Great Spirit. Wakantanka means Great Spirit, Spirit of the Sioux. Brahma in Hindu is closest to this archetype for the Hindus. And that would be the fourth tradition I mentioned before, the Sagittarian, Capricorn, and Leo sects and traditions in Hinduism. This would be the Aquarian sect surrounding Brahma. And then later in the axial period, Brahmic concepts were kind of the basis of the Upanishads and all of these more esoteric Vedic conceptual interpretations of things, which is quite fitting for Aquarius as a sign of dreaminess and thought and abstraction. Brahma represents the intellect in that way, the mind free from the trappings of the physical world that's fairly ascetic. And so Brahma really influences a lot of those more esoteric, spiritual, mystical movements within Hindu philosophy. The Brahmins, the upper class of the Hindu caste system, stems from this Brahma root related to essentially being above the lowly needs of the physical world, very ascetic. The Brahmins were essentially a class of intellectuals and priests who were kind of paid for and allowed to live their own life without needing to labor and toil and all these things that they relegate to the lower classes. And that sort of tradition, again, that sort of ascetic tradition actually kind of influences later Buddhist tradition, which focuses on enlightenment. And before, Gautama Buddha was all about reaching an ascetic detachment from your body and enlightenment within your mind. Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, actually strayed from this a little bit, but I have Buddha represented in another deity in this pantheon within the Pegasus cusp, actually. Bayame is almost similar from Aboriginal sources as their kind of sky father and creator who dreamt up the world in dream time. Olorun of the Yoruba is their own creator god of light and creation and sky. Jumala of the Finnish, and there's many different kind of versions of his name, is their sky creator god. He's Kugo Jumo to the Mari, another Finno-Ugric culture. And he represents light, and he's considered the white god in reference to the clouds and the sky. He's given in, say, the Mari pantheon a brother, a sort of evil brother, who is more of a dark or evil god of death and the underworld. His name's John. And John might relate to the Indo-European Yimo, who becomes Yama in Hindu, the first man to die, who became the god of the underworld. There's often, in many mythologies, this duality between the first two humans as essentially brothers or twins, one of them being good and one of them being evil. We see that prop up again in Judaic myth with Cain and Abel, for instance. Now, I keep saying creator god in a lot of these cases about the way that he creates. He's often portrayed as the first god, sure, or one of the first gods. He's not necessarily always older than, like I mentioned, Nexus or Chaos. He often comes up with the idea of creation, or the will to create, the dream, you might say, but is assisted by another deity who is more of an earth god, and in the Gnostic tradition is called Demiurge, and roughly represents this dualistic idea of the divine heavenly god who is good and pure and separate from the physical world, being incapable of creating the world because he is so pure, having an evil entity create the world for him. And thus the world has evil in it, and only through the interventions of the high Aquarian entity is the world able to like wrestle between good and evil. That explains in a very esoteric and Gnostic way the idea of why is the earth evil, why does evil exist, which is a very common in theological discourse. You even see this in the Lord of the Rings with Iluvatar in his conducting of the creation of the world with all of his children, creating the music of creation. the dissonance of Morgoth is what creates so much of the world. So that is kind of the demiurge idea. And that's essentially the opposite of this archetype. Well, here we have Oceanos. Oceanos, like with many of the entities in this list, is taken almost directly from the Greek example of Oceanos. I like it because it's so obvious to know what he represents. And of course, this kind of Poseidon appearance, this Neptune-Poseidon appearance, is probably one of the most popular images here because he is so well known. But there's a few twists on this particular character that I wanted to take from multiple different pantheons and emphasize. Again, there are two male deities in Pisces. The other one is the younger, and he represents the more human-centric kind of fisherman, boatman, pirate, I guess, a patron of sailors and such. He's not as much of a chaotic sea god. Here, Oceanos is like Olokun of Yoruba, representing sea life and nature. And he's very protective, like Tangaroa of Polynesian, of that nature. Tangaroa has many stories where he's fighting against humanity or against other gods that are seeking to abuse the sea. And that's quite noble and I think very interesting and cool motif to put into this mythology going forward in our contemporary world, where reefs are dying and there's the great ocean garbage patch, and the ocean and the seas are taking such a hit these days. I think it's important to have a motif like this that's very protective of that. Nun, or Nu, is the Egyptian primordial sea god, that idea of chaos I keep relating to. We talked about with Nexus, is her counterpart, is this chaos. And chaos is either chthonic, underground, watching over the waters like Abzu of Sumerian Babylonian myth, or he is of the oceans and the chaotic abyss. And the ocean, again, often represents space and the void, metaphorically, when we're talking about mythology and archetypes. You know, we have starships, right? Nun is, like chaos, one of the very first deities in existence. And his very name kind of represents nothingness, but also newness. Thaumas, I wanted to represent, is a somewhat obscure Greek deity as well. There's many sea gods in Greek that are largely very similar, but probably stem from slightly different linguistic sources. Some of them may be from Phoenician, some of them may be other cultures within the Aegean or outside of it. He relates linguistically to Thalassa, who is a sea goddess of Greeks, and Talas, who is an Albanian sea god. It's all very similar to Tehom, which is a concept in Judaic or Hebrew myth. Tehom represents the dark abyss, essentially. Kind of similar to Leviathan, a goddess in our pantheon here that I haven't shown. Leviatha, I went with. Similar to Tiamat and such from Babylonian myth. It is essentially said in the old biblical accounts that Hebrew God defeated the Leviathan and the abyss in order to become creator of the world. And that's very similar to the myth I talked about with Marduk. In order to prove their worth as king, they had to slay a dragon, and that's an old motif. In this case, it was the sea mother, unfortunately, that they usurped, Tiamat, Tehom, and Leviathan, indicating that that sea mother might be an even older entity that goes back even further for certain marine cultures that might have worshipped them, like Sedna, that's still worshipped by Inuit today. Thotsakan is similar to this kind of Thaumas oceanic deity, this time of the Thai. Ao Kuang is a draconic ocean god, not only of the sea, but also of storms. And this is another thing that gets coupled a lot. A lot of times the sea gods are also storm gods. Poseidon is often also associated with sea storms. In many ways, Zeus and Poseidon were vying for control over the Greek pantheon, and Poseidon was constantly finding ways to subtly rebel from Zeus and do his own thing, much like Pluto did. In truth, Zeus was not king of the gods in any real sense. The gods could be and do and rule wherever they did and however they liked. Ryujin, like Raiju, is a kind of chaotic god, him more of the sea. And whenever we mention a dragon, we need to acknowledge that a dragon is a force of chaos. Yam is another chaotic sea deity of the Phoenicians. And he fits into their story as essentially a version of Typhon that I mentioned before. Again, this great dragon of disaster and destruction. Yam to the Phoenicians, though, is treated a lot more personal, like a Poseidon type figure. He isn't purely a dragon or purely a force of chaos like Typhon is often portrayed. Kiase in the Hurrian myth, I think I mentioned in my Hittite video, is very linguistically related to chaos, the chaos being the Greek god of the primordial abyss, who in the story unleashes a sort of Leviathan upon his enemies, the heroes of the Hurrian pantheon, Teshub and Sauska. The sea monster he releases is Hidamu or Apsi. This myth very much resembles the story of Perseus, where Perseus essentially represents Teshub, the thunder god in that story, and then Andromeda represents Sauska, the beautiful maiden. In the Hurrian tale, Sauska actually seduces the dragon rather than being a completely helpless damsel in distress with Andromeda in the Greek tale. Sauska being more of a war goddess as well as a goddess of beauty. Not simply being like Aphrodite, but having aspects of Athena as well, which originally goes back to that Ishtar source. Kiase is kind of like Poseidon is the keeper of the Kraken, or Davy Jones in the Pirates of the Caribbean series. He isn't directly oppressing people, but he is sending and unleashing his monster, his Leviathan, upon people. Njord is this old Norse king of the gods from the Vanir, who might have been a group of Neolithic people living in Denmark and Sweden before the Aesir, who possibly were of Indo-European background, came in. Now, that's very speculative on my part there, but I have my hunches and my theories about a lot of the Vanir deities tended to be very Neolithic and agricultural, and they resembled deities from the Middle East, whereas a lot of the Aesir deities kind of had these Indo-European roots, like Thor. Possibly even some root to the same thing as the Egyptians with Nu or Nun, this Njord sort of idea. Lear of Welsh, or Lear in Irish, is another sea god who's a kind of grandfather of the Irish. And then a really interesting anecdote here, which I really enjoy, is Proteus, a quite obscure Greek god, is a sea god that represents the transformative power of life, essentially evolution and DNA, interestingly fitting for Pisces as a deity that is transformative and changeable, as a mutable sign and a water sign. Proteus represents essentially the first animal. And through transforming into many forms, he created all of the animals on the earth, starting in the seas, which is an interestingly accurate, prescient sort of prediction about where life came from on Earth. It was in the deep sea, at the core of what Oceanus represents. And with that, I have shown you all 12 of them. It took me 3 days to film this. I have a change of shirt, as you might have noticed. This is just a short preview. This is just 12 days. I've talked that long about just 12 of these cards that I've worked my ass off to create. I've gotten to a place in my research 6 months ago where I felt like I needed to actually turn it into something, something tangible, something real, something to put out there and to start a conversation with people. As a lot of this research I did on my own, I haven't had enough conversations with other people who are also experts in these kinds of fields, like philology, mythology, history. I really would like to have more discussions on these types of things. There are a few Discord servers I currently own that I think we might choose which one we want to start porting people from YouTube or elsewhere onto. But otherwise, just leave a comment and reach out in some manner. These videos take a lot of effort to make, and My last video on the Hittites did quite well. It was the first video I got to 1,000 views, and I'm happy about that. It makes me feel like I can at least hit that much every time. That slowly but surely my views are going up and up and up. I'm just not getting enough real interaction and support and exchange. I'm trying to find a way of engaging people more in actual discussion and maybe having live streams and things where we can actually interact in some way. And if you know of another YouTube channel that works on these sorts of things and is interested in this sort of syncretic work and comparative mythology, then shout them out to me or shout me out to them, and let's see if we can get an interview or something going. Although I have a Patreon and a Ko-fi, I co-own a business on Etsy that is able to take sales directly. In the case of Kickstarter here, you're able to directly fund something, and instead of just getting YouTube content, you can get an actual item. I have the luxury of being able to sponsor my own videos, essentially. But that also means that I'm not getting sponsored by anyone else to do this. And it's not like I'm paying myself to do this. I don't have money to pay myself to do this. Every video I make here is an advertisement insofar as if you like what I'm doing and what I'm working on, I have content that is made from that goes directly to supporting me continuing to do this. But as always, thank you for spending this time with me and taking interest in this crazy shit. I wish you well, and may the gods go with you on your journey. I'd like to refer back to what Studio Pandemonium means to me and to Callie as co-founders of this small Etsy business. By Pandemonia, we're referring to pandemonium. In John Milton's Paradise Lost, the main character, Lucifer, leads a council in the underworld of all of the spirits and daemons and deities and gods that have been banished to hell from the Abrahamic faiths. And he's meant to lead a revolution where these pagan gods are released once more into our world, showcasing the polytheistic variety of human thought and art and experience. So one thing that we're always trying to do in Studio Pandemonia is express, synthesize, integrate, syncretize various ideas from various cultures into a holistic worldview. By releasing all of the demons or daemons, recognizing them as not demons, but aspects of ourselves that we have repressed for a long time, then integrating that into a future worldview that is more holistic, more accepting, more nuanced. And this perspective to me is not purely, let's say, pagan or theistic or satanic. It's humanistic. Technically, I am an atheist. I don't believe in a god or any gods that are real in any physical or even afterlife type of sense. But regardless, I can find a way of practicing and understanding and representing and even channeling or living by certain virtues, motifs, archetypes that are inspiring or that are profoundly human. So that's essentially what this deck means to me. It means liberating all of these ideas and archetypes and expressing them through art. In this case, AI art. I used a combination of Midjourney and Photoshop's new generative fill features to kind of just go crazy on depicting deities that I have been researching for so long. It's so satisfying as a researcher and a graphic designer to be able to plug in ideas, environments, and styles and colors, and to describe a scene that has so many mythical undertones. There was actually a time where I was preparing to do this kind of deck for my research. It was always something of an ultimate goal to make an oracle deck of all these deities. I have some preliminary sketches of a few deities that I was working on. But when I saw the potential of AI generation, I started to experiment with it. And I started to find my language, my art style. Ultimately, I settled on a sort of statue aesthetic, making the deities look a bit uncanny, like intentionally, but not like so much AI art is just fantasy. It's like showing deities as being almost human or alive or powerful and just existing. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to show them as statues in potentially our own world, set up, built, and constructed in various locations. I wanted to portray them in a way that it felt like we could do that. Like we could make them real, that we could bring them back, that we could create new statues and new shrines and new temples for a more global pan-human pantheon. The Kickstarter was fully funded back in December, and the decks should be finished printing in early March. If you haven't pre-ordered one yet, you may do so now on our website, studiopandemonium.com. There's a link in the description as always. I have to ask to like, subscribe, and hit that bell thingy thing. Thank you. It all comes down to one word. Speak of world spinning lies. Oh, you try. False ideas will fail. The absentees will spin their time.